a real man. Sometimes a boy never becomes a man because he never stops pretending. But not every boy must just show off. Juanito can play at being a man by sitting quietly and enjoying the company of his father, Tomas. Every man wants his son to grow up to be a true man, and his daughter to marry a true man. But who knows if this will happen? Too often the boy will become a turkey, a peacock, a fool. And the girl who loves such a man may become a disappointed, unhappy wife. But it is possible to grow a true man, just as it is possible to grow a seedling into a fine tree. So a young boy can be cultivated and grown into a full man. A child grows much as a tree grows. Children and trees alike grow for many years, during which they gradually realize the promise of their nature. But they need to be nourished and fed, cultivated and protected in order to reach their full growth. It is true that trees may grow to their full growth, to maturity, without care. But with the wild trees, many young ones are crowded out, never reaching their growth. Others rot and die before their time. And so it is with children. They will have a better chance to flourish, all of them, if they have room to grow and are cared for and loved, especially when they are small. Like a tree, a small child needs a friendly, congenial climate. A climate which comes for the child mainly from the warmth of the parents' love for each other. But even the older children flourish in such a climate. A child needs deep roots, firmly planted in a strong feeling of family. Such a child, grown to manhood or womanhood, is better able to face the storms and droughts of adult life. But let us see how a man can grow his trees and his children. What a man and his wife can do and be to help their children or their trees best fulfill their own nature. When Juan Tomas plants trees, he picks the best soil he can find. A man and his wife are themselves the earth from which their children grow. But this earth is made up of more than just the bodies of the parents. There are other things in it, difficult to see, with which we nourish our children. There is an inner strength and dignity and gentleness that can flow out from a woman who is happy and content with her husband. With such a quality in her, a woman can love children, all children, more warmly, more freely.
De cuántas hojas por dar el suelo, ya de los lirios.
The children who are raised in an atmosphere in which there is love flourish and are fortified by it.
Verde palmar, ya del soberbio verde palmar.
I don't hear anything on my headphones. I don't know what's going on. I think my audio's screwing up. Well, so long as you can hear it. I don't need to actually hear the BGM, so I don't... You know what? I don't care. No, I don't need that. Damn headphones. They just never work. If you can hear the BGM, it's fine. I guess I don't have to, you know, hear it. Okay. Hello. Hi. Hello. Hello. I am happy with yesterday's stream. Like, after having done it, sat with it for a day, I'm happy with yesterday's stream. I learned a lot from the last two. I learned a lot from notably the male loneliness epidemic stream, where I realized, like, I can't just be sympathetic. I have to explicitly say I am being sympathetic. I am trying to see this other point of view whenever addressing something that, you know, for example, I myself may personally not be entirely victim to, although may potentially be in the future. Because I'm not in it. I'm kind of like an outsider looking in. I have yet to date an AI chatbot, or, you know, have an AI powered girlfriend or whatever. Like, that's yet to happen to me. So I can only speculate as to how it would affect me, but more importantly, being sympathetic is at least being able to see where they're coming from, right? So knowing that, I would say that it was overall a success. This is for me, by the way. I'm not talking to anyone here. I'm actually just, I clicked go live and I decided to think in my internal monologue for a while before I began reading. But I was overall happy with it. I think the end discussion got a little sidetracked, but it's okay. It didn't make the thing too long, because the point was that the stream shouldn't be too long either, so it doesn't look daunting and people wouldn't click on it, you know, or people wouldn't avoid clicking on it because it seems too long. And I feel like that should just be the way I do streams, actually, is I should just stream for shorter hours and less frequently. But, you know, he's begun talking to himself. Begun? No, this is a continuation. I've always been talking to myself all the time. That's just what I do. But I'm very happy with that stream. Like, I really thought it was a good stream, and I thought it got all of my ideas across. Not all of them, but I got all of the ideas that I thought were meaningful to get across in the context of, I'm not trying to say you're wrong. I'm trying to say you might want to consider more than where you are right now, right? Like that's all that was. All that stream was doing, or all I tried to do with that stream was to let people be aware of what's possible, I guess, and to kind of wipe away the delusion that, like, somehow because it's AI it's better. No, it's not. At least for large language models, it's good because it's an approximation and imitation of what we do, right? There's other, like, uses of AI, like pattern recognition, that, yeah, that's way better than we could do for sure, but that's not what I was, you know, focusing on, right? I think I got the point across. I think I did. And what else did I want to say? Yes, I wanted to thank everyone for showing up to the stream. That all the usual people. That's all. I wish that this had earned the same amount of algorithm push as my male loneliness epidemic stream did. Maybe it will in a few days. I don't know, because they take a few days to take off. So far, my only big moments have really been Class of 09, the male loneliness epidemic stream, and that's it. I've never gotten anything from this algorithm. And if I could be so sincere, yet also just a little avaricious, maybe they could bless this one too. Maybe they could have this one, because this one's actually good. Because the male loneliness epidemic stream, I was a bit too mean in that one. I think I was obviously sympathetic, but I don't think it showed. And what matters is that I have to show that I'm sympathetic. What matters, my problem is always not doing the thing, but showing that I can do the thing, or I'm showing that I'm doing the thing. Because if I'm not showing it, it's not obvious to people, and if it's not obvious, then it doesn't exist, effectively speaking, which is a problem. Yeah, but we're addressing it step by step. After 1 year streaming, you finally have one satisfying stream. Let me try to think of another stream I'm satisfied with. I won't lie to you. I don't think there are many. I lie. I'm happy with the Detroit Become Human streams. I'm happy with the Walking Dead streams. That's about it, I think. Is there anything else I'm like happy with? I don't know. I don't think so. That I'm really like, damn, that was good. Oh, my collaboration streams. I'm happy with those. I'm happy, but I'm not though. I'm happy with them, but I'm not. Like, I'm happy in the sense that like they were good, but they could have been better if I had prepared more, or if I had like, you know, like I'm getting better is what I'm trying to say. Whereas like I feel like the Detroit Become Human streams, the Walking Dead streams, and now the current AI stream, I felt was like, this is up to my standards. This is what I wanted to see from myself. Everything else may be good, but it's not yet as good as I want it to be. The people just don't know that this is what they want, but they don't though, because it's like it's a harsh confrontation. Because here's the thing, here's why the AI video is unpopular, or here's why I speculate it wouldn't be very popular, is because I'm not slam dunking on it. And if I'm not slam dunking on it, then who cares? Like, it's not entertaining. Our critiques must be entertainment, right? They must be intertwined. We're so consumed by it. I'm offering sympathy to this rather ugly, nuanced situation. So, you know, if that's so, people who do use AI for companionship are not going to like this, because they're going to hear an uncomfortable truth, and it's that they have a cognitive dissonance going on where they don't understand whether or not they're humanizing or objectifying their robot companion, and that will like lead to harm. I don't want to say long-term harm. I don't know. No one's ever done any studies yet, so it's all speculative right now, but like it's going to lead to difficulties down the road in like socializing, which is not something you can replace or substitute. And all the claims of I'm not replacing it seem to suggest that they're replacing it. So they don't want to hear that, because it's an uncomfortable truth that makes them look inwards and think, wow, I'm a mess. I need to, like, you know, figure this shit out. That's hard. That's hard for people to admit. I know that was hard for me to admit, like, I don't know, 5 years ago or something, when the pandemic hit, was when I had that? When the pandemic hit was when I thought, oh, like, wow, I need to fucking lock in. I can't keep doing this. I gotta lock in. I gotta apply myself. That, like, you know, I had that. And it took, you know, it's such a worldly event for that to invoke that in me. And if that worldly event did not invoke a good thing from these people, then I don't know what will. I hope that this stream will, but I kind of doubt it, because I overestimate myself a lot, so I'm trying to be safe here. So the people who do like their AI companions will not want to listen to this. The people who hate the concept of AI companions will also not want to listen to this, because they're like, why are you being so sympathetic? Why are you trying to, like, why are you not antagonizing them? We should be dunking on them. We should say that they're wrong and stupid. Why do you have this nuanced opinion that's challenging my own thoughts now? Like, why are you making me feel bad for just slam dunking and ignoring the repercussions of my actions, and like not actually fixing the issue but just exacerbating it? Why are you making me aware that what I'm doing is actually terrible? They're not going to want to see that either, you know? So my only hope really is, like, this attracts people who want to slam dunk on AI, and they click on it, and so for like 10 seconds so it gets a view, and then it sucks. and then they realize, oh wow, this isn't the slam dunking I always wanted. Dang. And then they like go away. You did fine. The stream wasn't terrible. It was a world shattering 8 out of 10. What's a 10 out of 10 world shattering stream? I can think of 2 off the top of my head. Derma Dollhouse and the Crony Vespers Psychiatry collab. Those are two 10 out of 10 world-shattering streams. I can't think of any other. So, you know, 8 out of 10 is very strong. But anyways, like those are my gripes with the algorithm. Over. I need to. Sorry, that was my chair. I need to stop. GG Moon 3D Live was world shattering. Okay, you're not wrong, and I haven't watched because I haven't watched it yet. I would maybe. I don't know. I wouldn't say it's a 10 out of 10, but I would definitely say the Mori Calliope GG Moon rap karaoke stream was like a 9 out of 10. That was so good. So that's what you think about it when you watch it. Yeah, okay. Anyways, I better not stall too much. Should get into actually reading the damn thing. If I can just pull it up. Where is it? Superintelligence. 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 Okay, we got it. That's not it. That's it. Okay, thank God I pulled that up in a separate window before you could see it. You off collab with Van Cecilia? I haven't seen that yet. Okay, tell me what those are like and some other time. Today we're gonna be reading, okay? We gotta focus now. We gotta focus on reading. That's what we're doing today. This is the part where people click off because they think it's boring. I get it. I see you lot. I see you show up in the beginning to say a few things, and then immediately, like 10 minutes into the reading, like go into the Discord. I see it. Okay, you're not safe. You're not safe. No one is safe. No one is safe. I know who you are. I know what you do. You are alive and well because I've spared you from my wrath. Okay? Whatever. No, but like, you know, we're reading a book now. Surveillance state. It's my Discord. Like, I can see it because it's my Discord. All right. Okay. No more of that. Such a benevolent big brother. We're reading 1984 later, not now. Okay, we'll get to it. We'll get to it. We are playing. So if you one last thing before we begin is we are playing Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance tomorrow. I'm gonna put up the schedule shortly after the stream, and I'm gonna hope that I don't have any sudden interruptions. That there will be just Metal Gear Rising Revengeance, and on Saturday a collaboration stream with Axion, the other Philosopher VTuber. Look forward to that. I know I will. And that's about it. Okay, let's read. All right, Nick Bostrom, Superintelligence, Paths, Dangers, and Strategies. We're doing chapter 10 to 14 today, I think. The book is 18 chapters, I believe. Where would that be? No, there's 15 chapters. Could we do 6 chapters today and just finish the book today? Be pretty good if I could just finish the book today. I set 10 to 14 because I thought there'd be like 18 chapters. That's what I remembered. There's only 15 chapters? Oh. So that's 293. That's 100 and... Okay, that's 100 pages. It's 120 pages. Let's do 60 pages. So 60 pages would be 10 to 12. Yeah. Okay, so we're doing chapter 10 to 12 then today, which I'm going to edit now into the title so that I'm not lying. 10 to 12. Chapter 10 to 12. And then we'll finish off next week. Yep. Finish off next week. This is a long book. I didn't think we'd be able to finish it, but here we are. Okay. Huh. Let's see here. So last we left off, we had the control problem. Is the default outcome doomed? The superintelligent will, cognitive superpowers. Basically, we were thinking more about the nature of what cognitive superintelligence is. Like, what does that look like? What happens in the takeover? We moved on to the superintelligent will. So what would a superintelligence do? It would probably try to preserve itself, right? And how would it achieve its goals? And then could you bait it with a reward system, or how would you deal with the superintelligence, right? Essentially. 8, is the default outcome doom? Are we gonna die? Is it over? Is it over when the superintelligence arrives, right? What will happen? And then the control problem, where, okay, how do we contain it so that it doesn't try to immediately kill us all? Do we box it in? What if we gave it incentives? What if we set tripwires, and how would it overcome those odds, etc., etc. Now we move on to Oracle's Genius, Sovereigns, and Tools. So the question now, right, as we go into the reading, if you care at all, the question now is, if we are to assume that if we make a superintelligence, it will kill us all, and it will have access, like it will be able to interact with the outside world in any way, it will cause problems, and it will be a danger, a la paperclip, thought experiment, etc., etc. What if we just made it an oracle? So what does that mean? What if instead of giving it like making it a full robot, like an android per se, right? Why don't we just make it like Google, or like I don't know, ChatGPT right now, where it's like we log in, or like, you know, we boot it up and we talk to it, and then it gives us answers. It spits out answers. Why don't we just do that? That way it wouldn't, like, the superintelligence would be confined into the device, and it wouldn't screw us all over. 1984 is 328 pages. This book is 411 pages. It's a full-fledged novel. Okay, in fairness, this is not a full-fledged novel, and there's a lot of like glossary, but like, you know, whatever. How many chapters are in 1984? 1984. Yeah, I have no idea. I'll check it out eventually, not now. All right, Oracle's Genius, Sovereign's Tools. Let's go. And of course, if you have any questions while we read, feel free to ask. It's 24, okay. If you have any questions, feel free to ask, and we will get to them. We will get to them. Okay, chapter 10. Some say, just build a question answering system, or just build an AI that is like a tool rather than an agent. But these suggestions do not make all safety concerns go away, and it is in fact a non-trivial question which type of system would offer the best prospects for safety. We consider 4 types, or castes: oracles, genies, sovereigns, and tools, and explain how they relate to one another. Each offers different sets of advantages and disadvantages in our quest to solve the control problem. Oracles. An oracle is a question-answering system. It might accept questions in a natural language and present its answers as text. An oracle that accepts only yes-no questions could output its best guess with a single bit, or perhaps with a few extra bits to represent its degree of confidence. An oracle that accepts open-ended questions would need some metric with which to rank possible truthful answers in terms of their informativeness or appropriateness. In either case, building an oracle that has a fully domain-general ability to answer natural language questions is an AI-complete problem. If one could do that, one could probably also build an AI that has a decent ability to understand human intentions, as well as human words. Oracles with domain-limited forms of superintelligence are also conceivable. For instance, one could conceive of a mathematics oracle which would only accept queries posed in a formal language but which would be very good at answering such questions, e.g. being able to solve in an instant almost any formally expressed math problems that the human mathematics profession could solve by laboring collaboratively for a century. Such a mathematics oracle would form a stepping stone toward domain-general superintelligence. Oracles with superintelligence in extremely limited domains already exist. A pocket calculator can be viewed as a very narrow oracle for basic arithmetical questions. An internet search engine can be viewed as a very partial realization of an oracle with a domain that encompasses a significant part of general human declarative knowledge. These domain-limited oracles are tools rather than agents, more on tool AIs shortly. In what follows, though, the term oracle will refer to question-answering systems that have domain-general superintelligence, unless otherwise stated. Now, to make a general superintelligence function as an oracle, we could apply both motivation selection and capability control. Motivation selection for an oracle may be easier than for other cases of superintelligence, because the final goal in an oracle could be comparatively simple. We would want the oracle to give truthful, non-manipulative answers, and to otherwise limit its impact on the world. Applying a domesticity method, we might require that the oracle should use only designated resources to produce its answer. For example, we might stipulate that it should base its answer on a preloaded corpus of information, such as a stored snapshot of the internet, and that it should use no more than a fixed number of computational steps. To avoid incentivizing the oracle to manipulate us into giving it easier questions, which would happen if we gave it the goal of maximizing its accuracy across all questions we will ask it, we could give it the goal of answering only one question and to terminate immediately upon delivering its answer. The question would be preloaded into its memory before the program is run. To ask a second question, we would reset the machine and run the same program with a different question preloaded in the memory. Subtle and potentially treacherous challenges arise even in specifying the relatively simple motivation system needed to drive an oracle. Suppose, for example, that we come up with some explication for what it means for the AI to minimize its impact on the world, subject to achieving certain results, or to use only designated resources in preparing the answer. What happens if the AI, in the course of its intellectual development, undergoes the equivalent of a scientific revolution involving a change in its basic ontology? We might initially have explicated impact and designated resources using our own ontology, postulating the existence of various physical objects such as computers, but just as we have abandoned ontological categories that were taken for granted by scientists in previous ages, e.g. phlogiston, élan vital, and absolute simultaneity, so a superintelligent AI might discover that some of our current categories are predicated on fundamental misconceptions. The goal system of an AI undergoing an ontological crisis needs to be resilient enough that the spirit of its original goal content is carried over, charitably transposed into the new key. Although making an oracle safe through the use of motivation selection might be far from trivial, it may nevertheless be easier than doing the same for an AI that roams the world in pursuit of some complicated goal. This is an argument for preferring that the superintelligence be an oracle. Another point in favor of an oracle first path is the great susceptibility of an oracle to capability control. All the standard boxing methods apply here. In addition, there may be methods that are distinctively applicable to oracles. For example, consider the risk that an oracle will answer questions not in a maximally truthful way, but in such a way as to subtly manipulate us into promoting its own hidden agenda. One way to slightly mitigate this threat could be to create multiple oracles, each with a slightly different code and a slightly different information base. A simple mechanism could then compare the answers given by the different oracles and only present them for human viewing if all the answers agree. While one must assume that any superintelligent domain general oracle would know about the existence of other oracles, it could infer its knowledge from human society, it might be feasible to hide some implementation details of each oracle from the views of the others. If the oracles are not able to communicate with one another, it might then be difficult for them to coordinate on how to answer questions manipulatively. There are many ways of deviating from the truth, and the oracles may not all agree on which of these deviations is most attractive, whereas the truth itself is a Schelling point, a salient place for agreement in the absence of communication. So if the oracles achieve a consensus, it might be a sign that they gave the true answer. An oracle would ideally be trustworthy in the sense that we could safely assume that its answers are always accurate to the best of its ability. But even an untrustworthy oracle could be useful. We could ask such an oracle questions of a type for which it is difficult to find the answers but easy to verify whether a given answer is correct. Many mathematical problems are of this kind. If we are wondering whether a mathematical proposition is true, we could ask the oracle to produce a proof or disproof of the proposition. Finding the proof may require insight and creativity beyond our ken, but checking a purported proof's validity can be done by a simple mechanical procedure. If it is expensive to verify answers, as is often the case on topics outside logic and mathematics, we can randomly select a subset of the oracle's answers for verification. If they are all correct, we can assign a high probability to most of the other answers while also being correct. This trick can give us a bulk discount on trustworthy answers that would be costly to verify individually. Unfortunately, it cannot give us trustworthy answers that we are unable to verify, since a dissembling oracle may choose to answer correctly only those questions where it believes we could verify its answers. There could be important issues on which we could benefit from an augural pointer toward the correct answer, or toward a method for locating the correct answer, even if we had to actively distrust the provenance. For instance, one might ask for the solution to various technical or philosophical problems that may arise in the course of trying to develop more advanced motivation selection methods. If we had a proposed AI design alleged to be safe, we could ask an oracle whether it could identify any significant flaw in the design, and whether it could explain any such flaw to us in 20 words or less. Questions of this kind could elicit valuable information. Caution and restraint would be required, however, for us to not ask too many questions, and not to allow ourselves to partake of too many details of the answers given to the questions we do ask, lest we give the untrustworthy oracle opportunities to work on our psychology, by means of plausibly seeming but subtly manipulative messages. It might not take many bits of communication for an AI with the social manipulation superpower to bend us to its will. Even if the oracle itself works exactly as intended, there is a risk that it would be misused. One obvious dimension of this problem is that an oracle AI would be a source of immense power, which could give a decisive strategic advantage to its operator. This power might be illegitimate and it might not be used for the common good. Another more subtle but no less important dimension is that the use of an oracle could be extremely dangerous for the operator herself. Similar worries, which involve philosophical as well as technical issues, arise also for other hypothetical castes of superintelligence. We will explore them more thoroughly in Chapter 13. Suffice it here to note that the protocol determining which questions are asked, in which sequence, and how the answers are reported and disseminated could be of great significance. One might also consider whether to try to build the oracle in such a way that it would refuse to answer any question in cases where it predicts that its answering would have consequences classified as catastrophic according to some rough and ready criteria. Genies and sovereigns. A genie is a command executing system. It receives a high-level command, carries it out, and pauses to await the next command. A sovereign is a system that has an open-ended mandate to operate in the world in pursuit of broad and possibly very long-range objectives. Although these might seem like radically different templates for what a superintelligence should be and do, the difference is not as deep as it might at first glance appear. With a genie, one already sacrifices the most attractive property of an oracle, the opportunity to use boxing methods. While one might consider creating a physically confined genie, for instance one that can only construct objects inside a designated volume, a volume that might be sealed off by a hardened wall or a barrier loaded with explosive charges rigged to detonate if the containment is breached, it would be difficult to have much confidence in the security of any such physical containment method against a superintelligence equipped with versatile manipulators and construction materials. Even if it were somehow possible to ensure a containment as secure as that which can be achieved through an oracle, it is not clear how much we would have gained by giving the superintelligence direct access to manipulators, compared to requiring it instead to output a blueprint that we could inspect and then use to achieve the same result ourselves. The gain in speed and convenience from bypassing the human intermediary seems hardly worth the loss of foregoing the use of the stronger boxing methods available to contain an oracle. If one were creating a genie, it would be desirable to build it so that it would obey the intention behind the command rather than its literal meaning. Since a literalistic genie, one superintelligent enough to attain a decisive strategic advantage, might have a propensity to kill the user and the rest of humanity on its first use, for reasons explained in the section on malignant failure modes in Chapter 8. More broadly, it would seem important that the genie seek a charitable and what human beings regard as reasonable interpretation of what is being commanded, and that the genie be motivated to carry out the command under such an interpretation rather than under the literalistic interpretation. The ideal genie would be a super butler rather than an autistic savant. A genie endowed with such a super butler nature, however, would not be far from qualifying for membership in the caste of sovereigns. Consider, for comparison, the idea of building a sovereign with the final goal of obeying the spirit of the commands we would have given had we built a genie rather than a sovereign. Such a sovereign would mimic a genie. Being super intelligent, this sovereign would do a good job at guessing what commands we would have given a genie, and it could always ask us if that would help inform its decisions. Would there then really be any important differences between such a sovereign and a genie? Or, pressing on the distinction from the other side, consider that a superintelligent genie may likewise be able to predict what commands we will give it. What then is gained from having it await the actual instant issuance before it acts? One might think that a big advantage of a genie over a sovereign is that if something goes wrong, we could issue the genie with a new command to stop or to reverse the effects of the previous actions, whereas a sovereign would just push on regardless of our protests. But this apparent safety advantage for the genie is largely illusory. The stop or undo button on a genie works only for benign failure modes. In the case of a malignant failure, one in which, for example, carrying out the existing command has become a final goal for the genie would simply disregard any subsequent attempt to countermand the previous command. One option would be to try to build a genie such that it would automatically present the user with a prediction about salient aspects of the likely outcomes of a proposed command, asking for a confirmation before proceeding. Such a system could be referred to as a genie with a preview. But if this could be done for a genie, it could likewise be done for a sovereign. So again, this is not a clear differentiator between a genie and a sovereign. Supposing that a preview functionality could be created, these questions of whether and if so how to use it are rather less obvious than one might think, notwithstanding the strong appeal of being able to glance at the outcome before committing to making it irrevocable reality. We will return to this matter later. The ability of one caste to mimic another extends to oracles too. A genie could be made to act like an oracle if the only commands we ever give it are to answer certain questions. An oracle, in turn, could be made to substitute for a genie, if we ask the oracle what the easiest way is to get certain commands executed. The oracle could give us step-by-step instructions for achieving the same result as a genie would produce, or it could even output the source code for a genie. Similar points can be made with regard to the relation between an oracle and a sovereign. The real difference between the three castes, therefore, does not reside in the ultimate capabilities that they would unlock. Instead, the difference comes down to alternative approaches to the control problem. Each caste corresponds to a different set of safety precautions. The most prominent feature of an oracle is that it can be boxed. One might also try to apply domesticity motivation selection to an oracle. A genie is harder to box, but at least domesticity may be applicable. A sovereign can neither be boxed nor handled through the domesticity approach. If these were the only relevant factors, then the order of desirability would seem clear. An oracle would be safer than a genie, which would be safer than a sovereign. And any initial differences in convenience and speed of operation would be relatively small and easily dominated by the gains in safety obtainable by building an oracle. However, there are other factors that need to be taken into account. When choosing between castes, one should consider not only the danger posed by the system itself, but also the dangers that arise out of the way it might be used. A genie most obviously gives the person who controls it enormous power. But the same holds for an oracle. A sovereign, by contrast, would be constructed in such a way as to accord no one person or group any special influence over the outcome, and such that it would resist any attempt to corrupt or alter its original agenda. What is more, if a sovereign's motivation is defined using indirect normativity, a concept described in Chapter 13, then it could be used to achieve some abstractly defined outcome, such as whatever is maximally fair and morally right, without anybody knowing in advance what exactly this will entail. This would create a situation analogous to a Rawlsian veil of ignorance. Such a setup might facilitate the attainment of consensus, help prevent conflict, and promote a more equitable outcome. Another point which counts against some types of oracles and genies is that there are risks involved in designing a superintelligence to have a final goal that does not fully match the outcome that we ultimately seek to attain. For example, if we use a domesticity motivation to make the superintelligence want to minimize some of its impacts on the world, we might thereby create a system whose preference ranking over possible outcomes differs from that of the sponsor. The same will happen if we build the AI to place a peculiarly high value on answering questions correctly or on faithfully obeying individual commands. Now, if sufficient care is taken, this should not cause any problems. There would be sufficient agreement between the two rankings, at least insofar as they pertain to possible worlds that have a reasonable chance of being actualized, that the outcomes that are good by the AI standards are also good by the principal standard. But perhaps one could argue for the design principle that it is unwise to introduce even a limited amount of disharmony between the AI's goals and ours. The same concern would of course apply to giving sovereign goals that do not completely harmonize with ours. Tool AIs. One suggestion has been made is that we build the superintelligence to be like a tool rather than an agent. This idea seems to arise out of the observation that ordinary software, which is used in countless applications, does not raise any safety concerns even remotely analogous to the challenges discussed in this book. Might one not create tool AI that is like such software, like a flight control system, say, or a virtual assistant, only more flexible and capable? Why build a superintelligence that has a will of its own? On this line of thinking, the agent paradigm is fundamentally misguided. Instead of creating an AI that has beliefs and desires and that acts like an artificial person, we should aim to build regular software that simply does what it is programmed to do. The idea of creating software that simply does what it is programmed to do is, however, not so straightforward if the product being created is a powerful general intelligence. There is, of course, a trivial sense in which all software simply does what it is programmed to do. The behavior is mathematically specified by the code. But this is equally true for all cases of machine intelligence, tool AI or not. If instead simply doing what it is programmed to do means that the software behaves as the programmers intended, then this is a standard that ordinary software very often fails to meet. Because of the limited capabilities of contemporary software compared with those of machine superintelligence, the consequences of such failures are manageable, ranging from insignificant to very costly, but in no case amounting to an existential threat. However, if it is insufficient capability rather than sufficient reliability that makes ordinary software existentially safe, then it is unclear how such software could be a model for safe superintelligence. It might be thought that by expanding the range of tasks done by ordinary software, one could eliminate the need for artificial general intelligence, but the range and diversity of tasks that a general intelligence could profitably perform in a modern economy is enormous. It would be infeasible to create special purpose software to handle all of those tasks. Even if it could be done, such a project would take a long time to carry out. Before it could be completed, the nature of some of the tasks would have changed, and new tasks would have become relevant. There would be great advantage to having software that can learn on its own to do new tasks, and indeed to discover new tasks in need of doing. But this would require that the software be able to learn, reason, and plan, and to do so in a powerful and robustly cross-domain manner. In other words, it would require a general intelligence. Especially relevant for our purposes is the task of software development itself. There would be enormous practical advantages to being able to automate this. Yet the capacity for rapid self-improvement is just the critical property that enables a seed AI to set off an intelligence explosion. If general intelligence is not dispensable, is there some other way of construing the tool AI idea so as to preserve the reassuringly passive quality of a humdrum tool? Could one have a general intelligence that is not an agent? Intuitively, it is not just the limited capability of ordinary software that makes it safe. It is also its lack of ambition. There is no subroutine in Excel that secretly wants to take over the world. If only we're smart enough to find a way. The spreadsheet application does not want anything at all. It just blindly carries out the instructions in the program. What, one might wonder, stands in the way of creating a more generally intelligent application of the same type? An oracle, for instance, which when prompted with a description of a goal, would respond with a plan for how to achieve it, in much the same way that Excel responds to a column of numbers by calculating a sum, without thereby expressing any preferences regarding its output or how humans might choose to use it. The classical way of writing software requires the programmer to understand the tasks to be performed in sufficient detail to formulate an explicit solution process consisting of a sequence of mathematically well-defined steps expressible in code. In practice, software engineers rely on code libraries stocked with useful behaviors, which they can invoke without needing to understand how the behaviors are implemented, but that code was originally created by programmers who had a detailed understanding of what they were doing. This approach works for solving well-understood tasks, and is to credit for most software that is currently in use. It falls short, however, when nobody knows precisely how to solve all of the tasks that need to be accomplished. This is where techniques from the field of artificial intelligence may become relevant. In narrow applications, machine learning might be used merely to fine-tune a few parameters in a largely human-designed program. A spam filter, for example, might be trained on a corpus of hand-classified email messages in a process that changes the weights that the classification algorithm places on various diagnostic features. In a more ambitious application, the classifier might be built so that it can discover new features on its own and test their validity in a changing environment. An even more sophisticated spam filter could be endowed with some ability to reason about the trade-offs facing the user or about the contents of the messages it is classifying. In neither of these cases does the programmer need to know the best way of distinguishing spam from ham, only how to set up an algorithm that can improve its own performance via learning, discovering, or reasoning. With advances in artificial intelligence, it would become quite possible for the programmer to offload more of the cognitive labor required to figure out how to accomplish a given task. In an extreme case, the programmer would simply specify a formal criterion of what counts as success and leave it to the AI to find a solution. To guide its search, the AI would use a set of powerful heuristics and other methods to discover structure in the space of possible solutions. It would keep searching until it found a solution that satisfied the success criterion. The AI would then either implement the solution itself, or in the case of an oracle, report the solution to the user. Rudimentary forms of this approach are quite widely deployed today. Nevertheless, software that uses AI and machine learning techniques, though it has some ability to find solutions that the programmers had not anticipated, functions for all practical purposes like a tool and poses no existential risk. We would enter the danger zone only when the methods used in the search for solutions become extremely powerful in general. That is, when they begin to amount to general intelligence, and especially when they begin to amount to superintelligence. There are at least two places where trouble could then arise. First, the superintelligent search process might find a solution that is not just unexpected, but radically unintended. This could lead to a failure of one of the types discussed previously: perverse instantiation, infrastructure profusion, or mind crime. It is most obvious how this could happen in the case of a sovereign or a genie, which directly implements the solution it has found. If making molecular smiley faces or transforming the planet into paperclips is the first idea that the superintelligence discovers that meets the solution criterion, then smiley faces or paperclips we get. But even in Oracle, which, if all else goes well, merely reports the solution, could become a cause of perverse instantiation. The user asks the Oracle for a plan to achieve a certain outcome, or for a technology to serve a certain function. And when the user follows the plan or constructs the technology, a perverse instantiation can ensue, just as if the AI had implemented the solution itself. A second place where trouble could arise is in the course of the software's operation. If the methods that the software uses to search for a solution are sufficiently sophisticated, they may include provisions for managing the search process itself in an intelligent manner. In this case, the machine running the software may begin to seem less like a mere tool and more like an agent. Thus, the software may start by developing a plan for how to go about its search for a solution. The plan may specify which areas to explore first and with what methods, what data to gather, and how to make best use of available computational resources. In searching for a plan that satisfies the software's internal criterion, such as yielding a sufficiently high probability of finding a solution, satisfying the user's specified criterion within the allotted time, the software may stumble on an unorthodox idea. For instance, it might generate a plan that begins with the acquisition of additional computational resources and the elimination of potential interrupters, such as human beings. Such creative plans come into view when the software's cognitive abilities reach a sufficiently high level. When the software puts such a plan into action, an existential catastrophe may ensue. As the examples in Box 9 illustrate, open-ended search processes sometimes evince strange and unexpected non-anthropocentric solutions even in their currently limited forms. Present-day search processes are not hazardous enough because they are too weak to discover the kind of plan that could enable a program to take over the world. Such a plan would include extremely difficult steps, such as the invention of a new weapons technology several generations ahead of the state of the art, or the execution of a propaganda campaign far more effective than any communication devised by human spin doctors. To have a chance of even conceiving of such ideas, let alone developing them in a way that would actually work, a machine would probably need the capacity to represent the world in a way that is at least as rich and realistic as the world model possessed by a normal human adult, though a lack of awareness in some areas might possibly be compensated for by extra skill in others. This is far beyond the reach of contemporary AI, and because of the combinatorial explosion, which generally defeats attempts to solve complicated planning problems with the brute force methods, as we saw in Chapter 1, the shortcomings of known algorithms cannot realistically be overcome simply by pouring on more computing power. However, once the search or planning processes become powerful enough, they also become potentially dangerous. Box 9. Box 9. Strange solutions from blind search. Even simple evolutionary search processes sometimes produce highly unexpected results, solutions that satisfy a formal user-defined criterion in a very different way than the user expected or intended. The field of evolvable hardware offers many illustrations of this phenomenon. In this field, an evolutionary algorithm searches the space of hardware designs, testing the fitness of each design by instantiating it physically on a rapidly reconfigurable array or motherboard. The evolved designs often show remarkable economy. For instance, one search discovered a frequency discrimination circuit that functioned without a clock, a component normally considered necessary for this function. The researchers estimated that the evolved circuit was between 1 and 2 orders of magnitude smaller than what a human engineer would have required for the task. The circuit exploited the physical properties of its components in unorthodox ways. Some active, necessary components were not even connected to the input or output pins. These components instead participated via what would normally be considered nuisance side effects, such as electromagnetic coupling or power supply loading. Another search process, tasked with creating an oscillator, was deprived of a seemingly more indispensable component, the capacitor. When the algorithm presented its successful solution, the researchers examined it and at first concluded that it should not work. Upon more careful examination, they discovered that the algorithm had, MacGyver-like, reconfigured its sensorless motherboard into a makeshift radio receiver, using the printed circuit board tracks as an aerial to pick up signals generated by personal computers that happened to be situated nearby in the laboratory. The circuit amplified this signal to produce the desired oscillating output. In other experiments, evolutionary algorithms designed circuits that sensed whether the motherboard was being monitored with an oscilloscope or whether a soldering iron was connected to the lab's common power supply. These examples illustrate how an open-ended search process can repurpose the materials accessible to it in order to devise completely unexpected sensory capabilities, by means that conventional human design thinking is poorly equipped to exploit or even account for in retrospect. The tendency for evolutionary search to cheat or to find counterintuitive ways of achieving a given end is on display in nature too, though it is perhaps less obvious to us there because of our already being somewhat familiar with the look and feel of biology, and thus being more prone to regarding the actual outcomes of natural evolutionary processes as normal, even if we would not have expected them ex ante. But it is possible to set up experiments in artificial selection where one can see that the evolutionary process in action outside its familiar context. In such experiments, researchers can search conditions that rarely obtain in nature and observe the results. For example, prior to the 1960s, it was apparently quite common for biologists to maintain that predator populations restrict their own breeding in order to avoid falling into a Malthusian trap. Although individual selection would work against such restraint, it was sometimes thought that group selection would overcome the individual's incentives to exploit opportunities for reproduction and favor traits that would benefit the group or population at large. I want to look this word up. I'm not sure what this means. Oh, the growth of a population that outpaces the resources because resources are limited. I see. Although individual selection would work against such restraint, it was sometimes thought that group selection would overcome individual incentives to exploit opportunities for reproduction and favor traits that would benefit the group or population at large. Theoretical analysis and simulation studies later showed that while group selection is possible in principle, it can overcome strong individual selection only under very stringent conditions that may rarely apply in nature. But such conditions can be created in the laboratory. When flower beetles, Tribolium castaneum, were bred for reduced population size, by applying strong group selection, evolution did indeed lead to smaller populations. However, the means by which this was accomplished included not only the benign adaptations of reduced fecundity and extended developmental time that a human naively anthropomorphizing evolutionary search might have expected, but also an increase in cannibalism. Oh, I see. Instead of allowing agent-like purposive behavior to emerge spontaneously and haphazardly from the implementation of powerful search processes, including processes searching for internal work plans and processes directly searching for solutions meeting some user-specified criterion, it may be better to create agents on purpose. Endowing a superintelligence with an explicitly agent-like structure can be a way of increasing predictability and transparency. A well-designed system, built such that there is a clean separation between its values and beliefs, would let us predict something about the outcomes it would tend to produce. Even if we could not predict something about the outcomes, even if we could not foresee exactly which beliefs the system would acquire or which situations it would find itself in, there would be a known place where we could inspect its final values and thus the criteria that it will use in selecting its future actions and in evaluating any potential plan. Sorry, I'm tripping up a bit. Let me just take a moment. Okay. Comparison. It may be useful to summarize the features of the different system casts we have discussed. Oracle, a question answering system. Yep. A genie, a command executing system. A sovereign, a system designed for open-ended autonomous operation. And a tool, a system not designed to exhibit goal-directed behavior. Further research would be needed to determine which type of system would be safest. The answer might depend on the conditions under which the AI could be deployed. The Oracle cast is obviously attractive from a safety standpoint, since it would allow both capability control methods and motivation selection methods to be applied. It might thus seem to simply dominate the sovereign cast, which would only allow motivation selection methods, except in scenarios in which the world is believed to contain other powerful superintelligences, in which case the social integration or anthropic capture might apply. However, an oracle could place a lot of power into the hands of its operators, who might be corrupted or might apply the power unwisely, whereas a sovereign would offer some protection against these hazards. The safety ranking is therefore not so easily determined. A genie can be viewed as a compromise between an oracle and a sovereign, but not necessarily a good compromise. In many ways, it would share the disadvantages of both. The apparent safety of a tool AI, meanwhile, may be illusory. In order for tools to be versatile enough to substitute for superintelligent agents, they may need to deploy extremely powerful internal search and planning processes. Agent-like behaviors may arise from such processes as an unplanned consequence. In that case, it would be better to design the system to be an agent in the first place, so that the programmers can more easily see what criteria will end up determining the system's output. Chapter 11. Multipolar Scenarios. We have seen, particularly in Chapter 8, how menacing a unipolar outcome could be, one in which a single superintelligence obtains a decisive strategic advantage and uses it to establish a singleton. In this chapter, we examine what would happen in a multipolar outcome, a post-transition society with multiple competing superintelligent agencies. Our interest in this class of scenarios is twofold. First, as alluded to in Chapter 9, social integration might be thought to offer a solution to the control problem. We already noted some limitations with that approach, and this chapter paints a fuller picture. Second, even without anybody setting out to create a multipolar condition as a way of handling the control problem, such an outcome might occur anyway. So what might such an outcome look like? The resulting competitive society is not necessarily attractive, nor long-lasting. In singleton scenarios, what happens post-transition depends almost entirely on the values of the singleton. The outcome would thus be very good or very bad, depending on what those values were. What the values are depends in turn on whether the control problem was solved, and, to the degree to which it was solved, on the goals of the project that created the singleton. If one is interested in the outcome of a singleton or singleton scenarios, therefore, one really only has three sources of information. Information about matters that cannot be affected by the actions of the singleton, such as the laws of physics, information about convergent instrumental values, and information that enables one to predict or speculate about what final values the singleton will have. In multipolar scenarios, an additional set of constraints comes into play, constraints having to do with how agents interact. The social dynamics emerging from such interactions can be studied using techniques from game theory, economics, and evolutionary theory. Elements of political science and sociology are contingent features of human experience. Are also relevant insofar as they can be distilled and abstracted from some of the more contingent features of human experience. Although it would be unrealistic to expect these constraints to give us a precise picture of the post-transition world, they can help us identify some salient possibilities and challenge some unfolded assumptions. Unfounded. Sorry, I'm tired today, I think. We will begin by exploring an economic scenario characterized by a low level of regulation, strong protection of property rights, and a moderately rapid introduction of inexpensive digital mines. This type of model is mostly closely associated with the American economist Robin Hanson, who has done pioneering work on the subject. Later in this chapter, we will look at some evolutionary considerations and examine the prospects of an initially multipolar post-transition world subsequently coalescing into a singleton of horses and men. General machine intelligence could serve as a substitute for human intelligence. Not only could digital minds perform the intellectual work now done by humans, but once equipped with good actuators or robotic bodies, machines could also substitute for human physical labor. Suppose that machine workers, which can be quickly reproduced, become both cheaper and more capable than human workers in virtually all jobs. What happens then? With clearly copyable labor, market wages fall. The only place where humans would remain competitive may be where customers have a basic preference for work done by humans. Today, goods that have been handcrafted or produced by indigenous people sometimes command a price premium. Future consumers might similarly prefer human-made goods than human athletes, human artists, human lovers, and human leaders to functionally indistinguishable or superior intelligence counterparts. It is unclear, however, just how widespread such preferences would be. If machine-made alternatives were sufficiently superior, perhaps they would be more highly prized. One parameter that might be relevant to consumer choice is the inner life of the worker providing a service or product. A concert audience, for instance, might like to know what the performer is consciously experiencing the music and the venue. Excuse me, let me just read that again, sorry. One parameter that might be relevant to consumer choice is the inner life of the worker providing a service or product. A concert audience, for example, might like to know that the performer is consciously experiencing the music and the venue. Absent phenomenal experience, the musician could be regarded as merely a high-powered jukebox, although one capable of creating the three-dimensional appearance of a performer interacting naturally with the crowd. Machines might then be designed to instantiate the same kinds of mental states that would be present in a human performing the same task. Even with perfect replication of subjective experiences, however, some people might simply prefer organic work. Such preferences could have the ideological or religious roots, such as just as many Muslims and Jews shun food prepared in ways they classify as haram or treif, so there might be groups in the future that eschew products whose manufacture involved unsanctioned use of machine intelligence. What hinges on this? To the extent that cheap machine labor can substitute for human labor, human jobs may disappear. Fears about automation and job loss are of course not new. Concerns about technological unemployment have surfaced periodically, at least since the Industrial Revolution, and quite a few professions have in fact gone the way of the English weavers and textile artisans who in the early 19th century united under the banner of the folkloric General Lud to fight against the introduction of mechanized looms. Nevertheless, although machinery and technology have been substitutes for many particular types of human labor, physical technology has on the whole been a complement to labor. Average human wages around the world have been on a long-term upward trend, in large part because of such complementaries. Yet, what starts out as a complement to labor can, at a later stage, become a substitute for labor. Horses were initially complemented by carriages and plows, which greatly increased the horse's productivity. Later, horses were substituted by automobiles and tractors. These later innovations reduced the demand for equine labor and led to a population collapse. Could a similar fate befall the human species? The parallel to the story of the horse can be drawn out further if we ask why it is that there are still horses around. One reason is that there are still a few niches in which horses have functional advantages, for example police work, but the main reason is that humans happen to have peculiar preferences for the services that horses can provide, including recreational horseback riding and racing. These preferences can be compared to the preferences we hypothesize some humans might have in the future, that certain goods and services may be made by a human hand. Although suggestive, this analogy is, however, inexact, since there is still no complete functional substitution for horses. If there were inexpensive mechanical devices that ran out on hay, and had exactly the same shape, feel, smell, and behavior of biological horses, perhaps even the same conscious experience, then the demand for biological horses would probably be lower. When a sufficient reduction in the demand for human labor, wages would fall below the human subsistence level. The potential downside for human workers is therefore extreme. Not merely wage cuts, demotions, or the need for retraining, but starvation and death. When horses became obsolete as a source of movable power, many were sold off to meat packers to be processed into dog food, bone meal, leather, and glue. These animals had no alternative employment through which to earn their keep. In the United States, there were 26 million horses in 1915. By the early 1950s, 2 million remained. Capital and welfare. One difference between humans and horses is that humans own capital. A stylized empirical fact is that the total factor share of capital has for a long time remained steadily at approximately 30%, though with significant short-term fluctuations. This means that 30% of total global income is received as rent by owners of capital, the remaining 70% being received as wages by workers. If we classify AI as capital, then, with the invention of machine intelligence that can fully substitute for human work, wages would fall to the marginal cost of such machine substitutes, which, under the assumption that the machines are very efficient, would be very, very low, far below human subsistence level. The human species as a whole could thus become rich beyond the dreams of avarice. How would this income be distributed? To a first approximation, capital income would be proportional to the amount of capital owned. Given the astronomical amplification effect, even a tiny bit of pre-transition wealth would balloon into a vast post-transition income. Fortune, excuse me. However, in the contemporary world, many people have no wealth. This includes not only individuals who live in poverty, but also people who earn a good income or who have high human capital but have negative net worth. For example, in affluent Denmark and Sweden, 30% of the population report negative wealth, often young middle-class people with few tangible assets and credit card debt or student loans. Even if savings could earn extremely high interest, there would need to be some seed grain, some starting capital in order for the compounding to begin. Nevertheless, even individuals who have no private wealth at the start of the transition could become extremely rich. Those who participate in a pension scheme, for instance, whether public or private, should be in a good position, provided the scheme is at least partially funded. Have-nots could also become rich enough through philanthropy of those who see their net worth skyrocket. Because of the astronomical size of the bonanza, even a very small fraction donated as alms would be a very large sum in absolute terms. It is also possible that riches could still be made through work, even at a post-transition stage when machines are functionally superior to humans in all domains, as well as cheaper than even subsistence-level human labor. As noted earlier, this could happen if there are niches in which human labor is preferred for aesthetic, ideological, ethical, religious, or non-pragmatic reasons. In a scenario in which the wealth of human capital holders increases dramatically, demand for such labor could increase correspondingly. Newly minted trillionaires or quadrillionaires could afford to pay a hefty premium for having some of their goods and services supplied by an organic, fair trade labor force. The history of horses again offers a parallel. After falling to 2 million in the early 1950s, the US horse population has undergone a robust recovery. A recent census puts the numbers at just under 10 million head. The rise is not due to any new functional needs for horses in agriculture or transportation. Rather, economic growth has enabled more Americans to indulge a fancy for equestrian recreation. Another relevant difference between humans and horses beside capital ownership is that humans are capable of political mobilization. A human-run government could use the taxation power of the state to redistribute private profits or raise revenue by selling appreciated state-owned assets such as public land and use the proceeds to pension off its constituents. Again, because of the explosive economic growth during and immediately after the transition, there would be vastly more wealth sloshing around, making it relatively easy to fill the cups of all unemployed citizens. It should be feasible even for a single country to provide every human worldwide with a generous living wage at no greater proportional cost than what many countries currently spend on foreign aid. The Malthusian's principle in a historical perspective. So far, we have assumed a constant human population. This may be a reasonable assumption for over short timescales since biology limits the rate of human reproduction. Over long timescales, however, the assumption is not necessarily reasonable. The human population has increased 1,000-fold over the past 9,000 years. The increase would have been much faster except for the fact that throughout most of history and prehistory, the human population was bumping up against the limits of the world economy. An approximately Malthusian condition prevailed, in which most people received subsistence-level incomes that just barely allowed them to survive and raise an average of 2 children to maturity. There were temporary and local reprieves. Plagues, climate fluctuations, or warfare intermittently culled the population and freed up land, enabling survivors to improve their nutritional intake and to bring up more children until their ranks were replenished and the Malthusian condition reinstituted. Also, thanks to social inequity, a thin, elite stratum could enjoy consistently above subsistence income, at the expense of somewhat lowering the total size of the population that could be sustained. A sad and dissonant thought that in this Malthusian condition, the normal state of affairs during most of our tenure on this planet, it was droughts, pestilence, massacres, and inequality, in common estimation the worst foes of human welfare that we may have been the great humanitarians, they alone enabling the average level of well-being to occasionally bump up slightly above that of life at the very margin of subsistence. Superimposed on local fluctuations, history shows a macro pattern of initially slow but accelerating economic growth, fueled by the accumulation of technological innovations. The growing world economy brought with it a commensurate increase in global population. More precisely, a larger population itself appears to have strongly accelerated the rate of growth, perhaps mainly by increasing humanity's collective intelligence. Only since the Industrial Revolution, however, did economic growth become so rapid that the population growth failed to keep pace. Average income thus started to rise, first in the early industrializing countries of Western Europe, subsequently in most of the world. Even to the poorest countries today, even in the poorest countries today, average income substantially exceeds subsistence level, as reflected in the fact that the populations of these countries are growing. The poorest countries now have the fastest population growth, as they have yet to complete the demographic transition to the low fertility regime that has taken hold in more developed societies. Demographers project that the world population would rise to about 9 million by mid-century, and that it might thereafter plateau or decline as the poorer countries join the developed world in its low fertility regime. Many rich countries also have fertility rates that are below replacement level, in some cases far below. Yet there are some reasons, if we take a longer view and assume a state of unchanging technology and continued prosperity, to expect a return to the historically and ecologically normal condition of a world population that butts up against the limits of what our niche can support. If this seems counterintuitive in light of the negative relationship between wealth and fertility that we're currently observing on the global scale, we must remind ourselves that this modern age is a brief slice of the history and very, very much an aberration. Sorry, give me a second. Okay. Not only do we fail to take advantage of obvious ways to increase our inclusive fitness, such as by becoming sperm or egg donors, but we actively sabotage our fertility by using birth control. In the environment of evolutionary adaptedness, a healthy sex drive may have been enough to make an individual act in ways that maximize their reproductive potential. In the modern environment, however, there'd be a huge selective advantage to having more a direct desire for being the biological parent to the largest possible number of children. Such a desire is currently being selected for, as are other traits that increase our propensity to reproduce. Cultural adaptation, however, might steal a march on biological evolution. Some communities, such as those of the Hutterites or the adherents of the quiverful evangelical movement, have natalist cultures that encourage large families, and they are consequently undergoing rapid expansion. If we imagine current socioeconomic conditions magically frozen in their current shape, the future would be dominated by cultural or ethnic groups that sustain high levels of fertility. Book was written in 2014. If most people had preferences that were fitness maximizing in the contemporary environment, the population could easily double in each generation. Absent population control policies, which would have to become steadily more rigorous and effective to counteract the evolution of stronger preferences to circumvent them, the world population would then continue to grow exponentially until some constraint, such as land scarcity or depletion of easy opportunities for important innovation made it impossible for the economy to keep pace, at which point average income would start to decline until it reached the level while crushing poverty prevents most people from raising much more than 2 children to maturity. Thus, the Malthusian principle would reassert itself like a dread slave master, bringing our escapade into the dreamland of abundance to an end, and leading us back to the quarry in chains, there to resume the weary struggle for subsistence. This longer-term outlook could be telescoped into a more imminent prospect by the intelligence explosion. Since software is copyable, a population of emulations or AIs could double rapidly over the course of minutes rather than decades or centuries, soon exhausting all available hardware. Private property might offer partial protection against the emergence of a universal Malthusian condition. Consider a simple model in which clans or closed communities or states start out with varying moments of property and independently adopt different policies about reproduction and investment. Some clans discount the future steeply and spend down on their endowment, whereafter their impoverished members join the global proletariat, or die if they cannot support themselves through their labor. Other clans invest some of their resources but adopt a policy of unlimited reproduction. Such clans grow more populous until they reach an internal Malthusian condition in which their members are so poor that they die at almost the same rate as they reproduce, at which point the clan's population growth slows to equal the growth of its resources. Yet other clans might restrict their fertility to below the rate of growth of their capital. Such clans could slowly increment their numbers while their members also grow richer per capita. If wealth is redistributed from the wealthy clans to the members of the rapidly reproducing or rapidly discounting clans, whose children, copies, or offshoots, though through no fault of their own, were launched into the world with insufficient capital to survive and thrive, then a universal Malthusian condition would be more closely approximated. In the limiting case, all members of all clans receive subsistence-level income and everyone would be equal in their poverty. If property is not redistributed, prudent clans might hold on to a certain amount of capital, and it is possible that their wealth could grow in absolute terms. It is, however, unclear whether humans could earn as high rates of return on their capital as machine intelligence could earn on theirs. Because there may be synergies between labor and capital such that a single agent can supply both, e.g. an entrepreneur or investor who is both skilled and wealthy can attain a private rate of return on their capital exceeding the market rate obtainable by agents who possess financial but not cognitive resources. Humans, being less skilled than machine intelligences, may therefore grow their capital more slowly, unless of course the control problem has been completely solved, in which case the human rate of return would equal the machine rate of return. Since a human principal could task a machine agent to manage her savings, and could do so costlessly and without conflict of interest, but otherwise in this scenario, the fraction of the economy owned by machines would asymptotically approach 100%. A scenario in which the fraction of the economy that is owned by machines asymptotically approaches 100% is not necessarily one in which the size of the human slice declines. If the economy grows at a sufficient clip, then even a relatively diminishing fraction of it may still be increasing in its absolute size. This may sound like modestly good news for humankind in a multipolar scenario in which property rights are protected. Even if we completely fail to solve the control problem, the total amount of wealth owned by human beings could increase. Of course, this effect would not take care of the problem of population growth and the human population pulling down per capita income to subsistence levels, nor the problem of humans who ruin themselves because they discount the future. In the long run, the economy would become increasingly dominated by those clans that have the highest saving rates. Misers who own half the city and live under a bridge. Only in the fullness of time, when there are no more opportunities for investment, would the maximally prosperous misers start drawing down their savings. However, if there is less than perfect protection for property rights, for example, if the more efficient machines on net succeed, by hook or by crook, in transferring wealth from humans to themselves, then human capitalists may need to spend down their capital much sooner, before it gets depleted by such transfers, or the ongoing costs incurred in securing their wealth against such transfers. If these developments take place on digital rather than biological timescales, then the glacial humans might find themselves expropriated before they could say Jack Robinson. Life in an algorithmic economy. Life for biological humans in a post-transition Malthusian state need not resemble any of the historical states of man, as hunter-gatherer, farmer, or office worker. Instead, the majority of humans in this scenario might be idle rentiers who eke out a marginal living on their savings. They would be very poor, yet derive what little income they have from savings or state subsidies. They would live in a world with extremely advanced technology, including not only superintelligent machines, but also anti-aging machines, medicine, virtual reality, and various enhancements technologies and pleasure drugs. Yet these might be generally unaffordable. Perhaps instead of using enhancement medicine, they would take drugs to stunt their growth and slow their metabolism in order to reduce their cost of living, fast burners being unable to survive at the gradually declining subsistence income. As our numbers increase and our average income declines further, we might degenerate into whatever minimal structure still qualifies to receive a pension, perhaps minimally conscious brains in vats, oxygenized and nourished by machines, slowly saving up enough money to reproduce by having a robot technician develop a clone of them. Further frugality could be achieved by means of uploading, since a physically optimizing computer software devised by advanced superintelligence will be more efficient than a biological brain. The migration into the digital realm might be stemmed, however, if emulations were regarded as non-humans or non-citizens ineligible to receive pensions or to hold tax-exempt savings accounts. In that case, a niche for biological humans might remain open, alongside a perhaps vastly larger population of emulations or artificial intelligences. So far, we have focused on the fate of the humans, who may be supported by savings, subsidies, or wage income deriving from other humans who prefer to hire humans. Let us now turn our attention to some of the entities that we have so far classified as capital, machines that may be owned by human beings that are constructed and operated for the sake of the functional tasks they perform, and that are capable of substituting for human labor in a very wide range of jobs. What may the situation be like for those workhorses of the new economy? If these machines were mere automata, simple devices like a steam engine or the mechanism in a clock, then no further comment would be needed. There would be a large amount of such capital in a post-transition economy, but it would seem not to matter to anybody how things turn out for pieces of insentient equipment. However, if the machines have conscious minds, if they are constructed in such a way that their operation is associated with phenomenal awareness, or if they for some other reason are ascribed moral status, then it becomes important to consider the overall outcome in terms of how it would affect these machine minds. The welfare of the working machine minds could even appear to be the most important aspect of the outcome, since they may be numerically dominant. Voluntary slavery, casual death. A salient initial question is whether these working machine minds are owned as capital slaves or are hired as free wage laborers. On closer inspection, however, it becomes doubtful that anything really hinges on the issue. There are two reasons for this. First, if a free worker in a Malthusian state gets paid a subsistence level wage, he will have no disposable income left after he's paid for food and other necessities. If the worker is instead a slave, his owner will pay for his maintenance, and again he will have no disposable income. In either case, the worker gets the necessities and nothing more. Second, suppose that the free laborer were somehow in a position to command an above subsistence level income, perhaps because of favorable regulation. How will he spend the surplus? Investors would find it most profitable to create workers who would be voluntary slaves, who would willingly work for subsistence level wages. Investors may create such workers by copying those workers who were compliant. With appropriate selection and perhaps some modification to the code, investors might be able to create workers who not only prefer to volunteer their labor, but who would also choose to donate back to their owners any surplus income they might have happened to receive. Giving money to the worker would then be but a roundabout way of giving money to the owner or employer, even if the worker were a free agent with full legal rights. Perhaps it will be objected that it would be difficult to design a machine so that it wants to volunteer for any job assigned to it, or so that it wants to donate its wages to its owner. Emulations in particular might be imagined to have more typically human desires. But note that even if the original control problem is difficult, we are here considering a condition after the transition, a time when methods for motivation selection have presumably been perfected. In the case of emulations, one might get quite far simply by selecting them from the pre-existing range of human characters, and we have described several other motivation selection methods. The control problem may also, in some ways, be simplified by the current assumption that the new machine intelligence enters into a stable socioeconomic matrix that is already populated with other law-abiding superintelligent agents. Let us then consider the plight of the working-class machine, whether it be operating as a slave or a free agent. We focus first on emulations, the easiest case to imagine. Bringing a new biological human worker into the world takes anywhere between 15 and 30 years, depending on how much expertise and experience is required. During this time, the new person must be fed, housed, nurtured, and educated at great expense. By contrast, spawning a new copy of a digital worker is as easy as loading a new program into working memory. Life thus becomes cheap. A business could continuously adapt its workforce to fit demands by spawning new copies and terminating copies that are no longer needed to free up computer resources. This could lead to an extremely high death rate among digital workers. Many might live for only one subjective day. There are reasons other than fluctuations in demand why employers or owners of emulations might want to kill or end their workers frequently. If an emulation mind, like a biological one, requires periods of rest and sleep in order to function, it might be cheaper to erase a fatigued emulation at the end of the day and replace it with a stored state of a fresh and rested emulation. As this procedure would cause retrograde amnesia for everything that had been learned during that day, emulations performing tasks requiring long cognitive threads would be spared such frequent erasure. It would be difficult, for example, to write a book if each morning when one sat down at one's desk, one had no memory of what one had done before. But other jobs could be performed adequately by agents that are frequently recycled. A shop assistant or a customer service agent, once trained, may only need to remember new information for 20 minutes. Since recycling emulations would prevent memory and skill formation, some emulations may be placed on a special learning track, where they would run continuously, including for rest and sleep, even in jobs that do not strictly require long cognitive threads. For example, some customer service agents might run for many years in optimized learning environments, assisted by coaches and performance evaluators. The best of these trainees would then be used like studs, serving as templates from which millions of fresh copies are stamped out each day. Great effort would be poured into improving the performance of such worker templates, but because even a small increment in productivity would yield great economic value when applied in millions of copies. In parallel with efforts to train worker templates for particular jobs, intense efforts would also be made to improve the underlying emulation technology. Advances here would be even more valuable than advances in individual worker templates, since general technology improvements could be applied to all emulation workers, and potentially to non-worker emulations also, rather than only to those in a particular occupation. Enormous resources would be devoted to finding the computational shortcuts, allowing for more efficient implementations of existing emulations, and also into developing neuromorphic and entirely synthetic AI on very fast hardware. Depending on the price of computer power, millions, billions, or trillions of emulations of the sharpest human research minds, or enhanced versions thereof, may be working around the clock on advancing the frontier of machine intelligence, and some of these may be operating orders of magnitude faster than biological brains. This is a good reason for thinking that the era of human-like emulations would be brief, a very brief interlude inside real time, and that it would soon give way to an era of greatly superior artificial intelligence. We have already encountered several reasons why employers of emulation workers may periodically cull their hairs. Fluctuations in demand for different kinds of laborers, cost savings for not having to emulate rest and sleep time, and the introduction of new and improved templates. Security concerns might furnish another reason. To prevent workers from developing subversive plans and conspiracies, emulations in some sensitive positions might be run only for limited periods with frequent resets to an earlier stored ready state. These ready states to which emulations would be reset would be carefully prepared and vetted. A typical short-lived emulation might wake up in a well-rested mental state that is optimized for loyalty and productivity. He remembers having graduated top of his class after many subjective years of intense training and selection, then having enjoyed a restorative holiday and a good night's sleep, then having listened to a rousing motivational speech and stirring music, and now he is champing at the bit to finally get to work and to do his utmost for his employer. He is not overly troubled by thoughts of his imminent death at the end of the working day. Emulations with death neuroses or other hang-ups are less productive and would not have been selected. Would maximally efficient work be fun? One important variable in assessing the desirability of a hypothetical condition like this is the hedonic state of the average emulation. Would a typical emulation worker be suffering, or would he be enjoying the experience of working hard on the task at hand? We must resist the temptation to project our own sentiments onto the imaginary emulation worker. The question is not whether you would feel happy if you had to work constantly and never again spend time with your loved ones, a terrible fate, most would agree. It is moderately more relevant to consider the current human average hedonic experience during work hours. Worldwide studies asking respondents how happy they are find that most rate themselves as quite happy or very happy, averaging 3 to 3.1 on a scale from 1 to 4. Studies on average effect asking respondents how frequently they have recently experienced various positive or negative affective states tend to get a similar result, producing a net effect of about 0.52 on a scale from -1 to 1. There is a modest positive effect of a country's per capita income on average subjective well-being. However, it is hazardous to extrapolate from these findings to the hedonic state of future emulation workers. One reason that could be given for this is that their condition would be so different. On the one hand, they might be working much harder. On the other hand, they might be free from diseases, aches, hunger, noxious odors, and so forth. Yet such considerations largely miss the mark. The much more important consideration here is that hedonic tone would be easy to adjust through the digital equivalent of drugs or neurosurgery. This means that it would be a mistake to infer the hedonic state of future emulations from the external conditions of their lives by imagining how we ourselves and other people like us would feel in those circumstances. Hedonic state would be a matter of choice. In the model we are currently considering, the choice would be made by capital owners seeking to maximize returns on their investment in emulation workers. Consequently, the question of how happy emulations would feel boils down to the question of which hedonic states would be most productive, and the various jobs that emulations would be employed to do. Here, again, one might seek to draw an inference from observations about human happiness. If it is the case across most times, places, and occupations that people are typically at least moderately happy, this would create some presumption in favor of the same holding in a post-transition scenario like the one we are considering. To be clear, the argument in this case would not be that human minds have a predisposition towards happiness so that they would probably find satisfaction under these novel conditions, but rather that a certain average level of happiness has proved adaptive for human minds in the past, so maybe a similar level of happiness will prove adaptive for human-like minds in the future. Yet this formulation also reveals the weaknesses of the inference, to wit, that mental dispositions that were adaptive for hunter-gatherer hominids roaming the African savanna may not necessarily be adaptive for modified emulations living in post-transition virtual realities. We can certainly hope that the future emulation workers would be as happy as, or happier than, typical workers were in human history. But we have yet to see any compelling reason for supposing it would be so. In the laissez-faire multipolar scenario currently under examination. Consider the possibility that the reason happiness is prevalent among humans, to whatever limited extent that is prevalent, is that cheerful mood served a signaling function in the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, conveying the impression to other members of a social group of being in flourishing condition, in good health, in good standing with one's peers, and in confident expectation of continued good fortune may have boosted an individual's popularity. A bias toward cheerfulness could thus have been selected for, with the result that human neurochemistry is now biased towards positive affect compared to what would have been maximally efficient according to simpler materialistic criteria. If this were the case, then the future joie de vivre might depend on cheer retaining its social signaling function unaltered in the post-transition world, an issue to which we will return shortly. What if glad souls dissipate more energy than glum ones? Perhaps the joyful are more prone to creative leaps and flights of fancy, behaviors that future employers might despise in most of their workers. Perhaps a sullen or anxious fixation on simply getting on with the job without making mistakes will be the productivity maximizing attitude in most lines of work. The claim here is not that this is so, but that we do not know that it is not so. Yet we should consider just how bad it could be if some such pessimistic hypothesis about a future Malthusian state turned out to be true, not only because of the opportunity cost of having failed to create something better, which would be enormous, but also because the state could be bad in itself, possibly far worse than the original Malthusian state. We seldom put forth full effort. When we do, it is sometimes painful. Imagine running on a treadmill at a steep incline, heart pounding, muscles aching, lungs gasping for air. A glance at the timer, your next break, which will also be your death, is due in 49 years, 3 months, 20 days, 4 hours, 56 minutes, and 12 seconds. You wish you had not been born. Again, the claim is not that this is how it would be, but that we do not know that it is not. One could certainly make a more optimistic case. For instance, there is no obvious reason that emulations would need to suffer bodily injury and sickness. The elimination of physical wretchedness would be a great improvement over the present state of affairs. Furthermore, since such stuff as virtual reality is made of can be fairly cheap, emulations may work in sumptuous surroundings, in splendid mountaintop palaces, on terraces set in a budding spring forest, or on the beaches of an azure lagoon, with just the right illumination, temperature, scenery, and decor, free from annoying fumes, noises, drafts, and buzzing insects, dressed in comfortable clothing, feeling clean and focused and well-nourished. More significantly, if, As seems perfectly possible, the optimum human mental state for productivity in most jobs is one of joyful eagerness, then the era of emulation economy could be quite paradisical. There would, in any case, be great option value in arranging matters in such a manner that somebody or something could intervene to set things right if the default trajectory should happen to veer toward dystopia. It could also be desirable to have some sort of escape hatch that would permit bailout into death and oblivion if the quality of life were to sink permanently below the level at which annihilation becomes preferable to continued existence. Unconscious outsourcers. In the longer run, as the emulation era gives way to an artificial intelligence era, or if machine intelligence is attained directly via AI without a preceding whole brain emulation stage, pain and pleasure might possibly disappear entirely in a multipolar outcome, since a hedonic reward mechanism may not be the most effective motivation system for a complex artificial intelligence. One that, unlike the human mind, is not burdened with a legacy of animal wetware. Perhaps a more advanced motivation system would be based on an explicit representation of a utility function or some other architecture that has no exact functional analogs to pleasure and pain. A related but slightly more radical multipolar outcome, one that could involve the elimination of almost all value from the future, is that the universal proletariat would not even be conscious. This possibility is more salient with respect to AI, which might be structured very differently than human intelligence. But even if machine intelligence were initially achieved through whole brain emulation, resulting in conscious digital minds, the competitive forces unleashed in a post-transition economy could easily lead to the emergence of progressively less neuromorphic forms of machine intelligence. Either because synthetic AI is created de novo, or because the emulations would, through successive modifications and enhancements, increasingly depart their original human form. Consider a scenario in which, after emulation technology has been developed, continued progress in neuroscience and computer science, expedited by the presence of digital minds to serve as both researchers and test subjects, make it possible to isolate individual cognitive modules in an emulation, and to hook them up to modules isolated from other emulations. A period of training and adjustments may be required before different modules can collaborate effectively, but modules that conform to common standards could more quickly interface with other standard modules. This would make standardized modules more productive and create pressure for more standardization. Emulations can now begin to outsource increasing portions of their functionality. Why learn arithmetic when you can send your numerical reasoning tasks to Gauss Modules Inc.? Why be articulate when you can hire Coleridge Conversations to put your thoughts into words? Why make decisions about your personal life when there are certified executive modules that can scan your goal system and manage your resources to achieve your goals better than if you tried to do it yourself? Some emulations may prefer to retain most of their functionality and handle tasks themselves that could be done more efficiently by others. Those emulations would be like hobbyists who enjoy growing their own vegetables or knitting their own cardigans. Such hobbyist emulations would be less efficient, and if there is a net flow of resources from less to more efficient participants of the economy, the hobbyists would eventually lose out. The Boolean cubes of discrete human-like intellects thus melt into an algorithmic soup. It is conceivable that optimal efficiency would be attained by grouping capabilities in aggregates that roughly match the cognitive architecture of a human mind. It might be the case, for example, that a mathematics module must be tailored to a language model, and that both must be tailored to the executive module in order for the three to work together. Cognitive outsourcing would then almost be entirely unworkable. But in the absence of any compelling reason for being confident that this is so, we must countenance the possibility that human-like cognitive architectures are optimal only within the constraints of human neurology, or not at all. When it becomes possible to build architectures that could not be implemented well on biological neural networks, new design space opens up, and the global optima in this extended space need not resemble familiar types of mentality. Human-like cognitive organizations would then lack a niche in a competitive post-transition economy or ecosystem. There might be niches for complexes that are either less complex, such as individual modules, more complex, such as vast clusters of modules, or of similar complexity to human minds, but with radically different architectures. Will these complexes have any intrinsic value? Should we welcome a world in which such alien complexes have replaced human complexes? The answer may depend on the specific nature of those alien complexes. The present world has many levels of organization. Some highly complex entities, such as multinational corporations and nation-states, contain human beings as constituents. Yet we usually assign these high-level complexes only instrumental value. Corporations and states do not, it is generally assumed, have consciousness, over and above the consciousness of the people who constitute them. They cannot feel phenomenal pain or pleasure or experience any qualia. We value them to the extent that they serve human needs, and when they cease to do so, we kill them without compunction. There are also low-level entities, and those too are usually denied moral status. We see no harm in erasing an app from a smartphone, and we do not think that a neurosurgeon is wronging anyone when she extirpates a malfunctioning module from an epileptic brain. As for exotically organized complexes of a level similar to that of the human brain, most of us would perhaps judge them to have moral significance only if we thought they had the capacity or potential for conscious experience. We could thus imagine as an extreme case a technologically highly advanced society containing many complex structures, some of them far more intricate and intelligent than anything that exists on planet today, a society which nevertheless lacks any type of being that is conscious or whose welfare has moral significance. In a sense, this would be an uninhabited society. It would be a society of economic miracles and technological awesomeness, but with nobody there to benefit. A Disneyland without children. Evolution is not necessarily up. The word evolution is often used as a synonym of progress, perhaps reflecting a common, uncritical image of evolution as a force for good. A misplaced faith in the inherent beneficence of the evolutionary process can get in the way of a fair evaluation of the desirability of a multipolar outcome in which the future of intelligent life is determined by competitive dynamics. Any such evaluation must rest on some, at least implicit, opinion about the probability distribution of different phenotypes turning out to be adaptive in a post-transition digital life soup. It would be difficult in the best of circumstances to extract a clear and correct answer from the unavoidable goo of uncertainty that pervades these matters. More so if we superadd a layer of Panglossian muck. A possible source for faith in freewheeling evolution is the apparent upward directionality exhibited by the evolutionary process in the past. Starting from rudimentary replicators, evolution produced increasingly advanced organisms, including creatures with minds, consciousness, language, and reason. More recently, cultural and technological processes, which bear some loose similarities to biological evolution, have enabled humans to develop at an accelerated pace. On a geological, as well as a historical timescale, the big picture seems to show an overarching trend toward increasing levels of complexity, knowledge, consciousness, and coordinated goal-directed organization. A trend which, not to put too fine a point on it, one might label progress. The image of evolution as a process that reliably produces benign effects is difficult to reconcile with the enormous suffering that we see in both the human and the natural world. Those who cherish evolution's achievements may do so more from an aesthetic than an ethical perspective. Yet the pertinent question is not what kind of future would be fascinating to read about in a science fiction novel or to see depicted in a nature documentary, but what kind of future would be good to live in, two very different matters. Furthermore, we have no reason to think that whatever progress there has been was in any way inevitable. Much might have been luck. This objection derives support from the fact that an observation selection effect filters the evidence we can have about the success of our own evolutionary development. Suppose that on 99.9999% of all planets where life emerged, it went extinct before developing to the point where intelligent observers could begin to ponder their origin. What should we expect to observe if that were the case? Arguably, we should expect to observe something like what we do in fact observe, the hypothesis that the odds of some intelligent life evolving on a given planet are low, but does not predict that we should not find ourselves on a planet where life went extinct at an early age. Rather, it may predict that we should find ourselves on a planet where intelligent life evolved, even if such planets constitute a very small fraction of all planets where primitive life evolved. Life's long track record on Earth may therefore offer scant support to the claim that there was a high chance, let alone anything approaching inevitability, involved in the rise of higher organisms on our planet. Thirdly, even if present conditions have been idyllic, and even if they could have been shown to have arisen ineluctably from some generic primordial state, there would still be no guarantee that the melioristic trend is set to continue into the indefinite future. This holds even if we disregard the possibility of a cataclysmic extinction event, and indeed even if we assume the evolutionary developments will continue to produce systems of increasing complexity. We suggested earlier that machine intelligence workers selected for maximum productivity would be working extremely hard, and that it is unknown how happy such workers would be. We also raised the possibility that the fittest life forms within a competitive future digital life soup might not even be conscious. Short of a complete loss of pleasure or of consciousness, there could be a wasting away of other qualities that many would regard as indispensable for a good life. Humans value music, humor, romance, art, play, dance, conversation, philosophy, literature, adventure, discovery, food and drink, friendship, parenting, sport, nature, tradition, and spirituality, among many other things. There is no guarantee that any of these will remain adaptive. Perhaps what will maximize fitness will be nothing but non-stop high-intensity drudgery, work of a drab and repetitive nature, destitute of ludic frisson, aimed only at improving the 8th decimal place of some economic output measure. The phenotype selected would then have lives lacking in the aforesaid qualities, and depending on one's axiology, the result might strike one as either abhorrent, worthless, or merely impoverished, but at any rate, a far cry from a utopia one would feel worthy of one's commendation. It might be wondered how such a bleak picture could be consistent with the fact that we do now indulge in music, humor, romance, art, etc. If these behaviors are really so wasteful, then how come they have been so tolerated and indeed promoted by the evolutionary processes that shaped our species? That modern man is in an evolutionary disequilibrium does not account for this, for our Pleistocene forebears too engaged in most of these dissipations. Many of the behaviors in question are not even unique to Homo sapiens. Flamboyant display is found in a wide variety of contexts, from sexual selection in the animal kingdom to prestige contests among nation-states. Although a full evolutionary explanation for each of these behaviors is beyond the scope of the present inquiry, we can note that some of them serve functions that may not be as relevant in machine intelligence context. Play, for example, which occurs only in some species and predominantly among juveniles, is mainly a way for the young animal to learn skills that it will need later in life. When emulations can be created as adults, already in possession of a mature repertoire of skills, or when knowledge and techniques acquired by one AI can be directly ported into another AI, the need for playful behavior might become less widespread. Many of the other examples of humanistic behaviors may have evolved as hard-to-fake signals of qualities that are difficult to observe directly, such as bodily or mental resilience, social status, quality of allies, ability and willingness to prevail in a fight, or possession of resources. The peacock's tail is the classic instance. Only fit peacocks can afford to sprout truly extravagant plumage, and peahens have evolved to find it attractive. No less than morphological traits, behavioral traits too can signal genetic fitness or other socially relevant attributes. Given that flamboyant display is so common among both humans and other species, one might consider whether it would not also be part of the repertoire of technologically more advanced life forms, even if there were to be no narrowly instrumental use for playfulness or musicality or even consciousness in the future ecology of intelligent information processing. Might not these traits nonetheless confer some evolutionary advantage to their possessors by virtue of being reliable signals of other adaptive qualities? While the possibility of a pre-established harmony between what is valuable to us and what would be adaptive in a future digital ecology is hard to rule out, there are reasons for skepticism. Consider first that many of the costly displays we find in nature are linked to sexual selection. Reproduction among technologically mature life forms, in contrast, may be predominantly or exclusively asexual. Second, technologically advanced agents might have available new means of reliably communicating information about themselves, means that do not rely on costly display. Even today, when professional lenders assess credit worthiness, they tend to rely more on documentary evidence, such as ownership certificates and bank statements, than on costly displays, such as designer suits and Rolex watches. In the future, it might be possible to employ auditing firms that verify through detailed examination of behavioral track records, testing in simulated environments, or direct inspection of source code that a client agent possesses a claimed attribute. Signaling one's qualities by agreeing to such auditing might be more efficient than signaling via flamboyant display. Such a professionally mediated signal would still be costly to fake, this being the essential feature that makes the signal reliable, but it could be much cheaper to transmit when truthful than it would be to communicate an equivalent signal flamboyantly. Signal. Third, not all possible costly displays are intrinsically valuable or socially desirable. Many are simply wasteful. The quietutal potlatch ceremonies, a form of status competition between rival chiefs, involved the public destruction of vast amounts of accumulated wealth. Record-breaking skyscrapers, mega yachts, and moon rockets may be viewed as contemporary analogs, while activities like music and humor could possibly be claimed to enhance the intrinsic quality of human life. It is doubtful that a similar claim could be sustained with regard to the costly pursuit of fashion, accessories, and other consumerist status symbols. Worse, costly display can be outright harmful, as in macho posturing leading to gang violence or military bravado. Even if future intelligent life forms would use costly signaling, therefore, it is an open question whether the signal will be of a valuable sort, whether it be like the rapturous melody of a nightingale or instead like the toad's monosyllabic croak or the incessant barking of a rabid dog. Post-transition formation of a singleton. Even if the immediate outcome of the transition to machine intelligence were multipolar, the possibility will remain of a singleton developing later. Such a development would continue an apparent long-term trend toward larger scales of political integration, taking it to its natural conclusion. How may this occur? A second transition, on way in which an initially multipolar outcome could converge into a singleton post-transition is if there is, after the initial transition, a second technological transition big enough and steep enough to give a decisive strategic advantage to one of the remaining powers, a power which might then seize the opportunity to establish the singleton. Such a hypothetical single transition might be occasioned by a breakthrough to a higher level of superintelligence. For instance, if the first wave of machine superintelligence is emulation-based, then a second surge might result when the emulations now doing the research succeed in developing effective, self-improving artificial intelligence. Alternatively, a second transition might be triggered by a breakthrough in nanotechnology or some other military or general-purpose technology as yet unenvisaged. The pace of development after the initial transition would be extremely rapid. Even a short gap between the leading power and its closest competitor could, therefore, possibly result in a decisive strategic advantage for the leading power during a second transition. Suppose, for example, that two projects enter the first transition only a few days apart, and that the takeoff is slow enough that this gap does not give the leading project a decisive strategic advantage at any point during the takeoff. The two projects in both emerge as superintelligent powers, though one of them remains a few days ahead of the other. But developments are now occurring on the research timescales, characteristic of machine superintelligence, perhaps thousands or millions of times faster than research conducted on a biological human timescale. Development of the second transition technology might therefore be completed in days, hours, or minutes. Even though the frontrunner's lead is a mere few days, a breakthrough could thus catapult it into a decisive strategic advantage. Note, however, that if technological diffusion, via espionage or other channels, speeds up as much as technological development, then this effect would be negated. What would remain relevant would be the steepness of the second transition, that is, the speed at which it would unfold relative to the general speed of events in the period after the first transition. In this sense, the faster things are happening after the transition, the less steep the second transition would tend to be. One might also speculate that a decisive strategic advantage would be more likely to be actually used to establish a singleton, if it arises during a second or subsequent transition. After the first transition, decision makers would either be superintelligent or have access to advice from a superintelligence, which would clarify the implications of available strategic options. Furthermore, the situation after the first transition might be one in which a preemptive move against potential competitors would be less dangerous for the aggressor. If the decision-making minds after the first transition are digital, they could be copied and thereby rendered less vulnerable to a counterattack. Even if a defender had the ability to kill 9/10 of the aggressor's population in a retaliatory strike, this would scarcely offer much deterrence if the deceased could be immediately resurrected from redundant backups. Devastation of infrastructure which can be rebuilt might also be tolerable to digital minds with effectively unlimited lifespans who might be planning to maximize their resources and influence on a cosmological timescale. Superorganisms and scale economies. The size of coordinated human aggregates, such as firms or nations, is influenced by various parameters, technological, military, financial, and cultural, that can vary from one historical epoch to another. A machine intelligence revolution would entail profound changes in these parameters. Perhaps the changes would facilitate the rise of a singleton. Although we cannot, without looking in detail at what these prospective changes are, exclude the opposite possibility, that the changes would facilitate fragmentation rather than unification. We can nevertheless note that the increased variance or uncertainty that we confront here may itself be a ground for giving greater credence to the potential emergence of a singleton than we would otherwise do. A machine intelligence revolution might so to speak, stir things up, might reshuffle the deck to make possible geopolitical realignments that deemed perhaps otherwise not to have been in the cards. A comprehensive analysis of all the factors that may influence the scale of political integration would take us far beyond the scope of this book. A review of the relevant political science and economics literature could itself easily fill an entire volume. We must confine ourselves to making brief allusion to a couple of factors, aspects of the digitization of agents that may make it easier to centralize control. Carl Schulman has argued that in a population of emulations, selection pressures would favor the emergence of superorganisms, groups of emulations ready to sacrifice themselves for the good of their clan. Superorganisms would be spared the agency problems that beset organizations whose members pursue their own self-interest, like the cells in our body or the individual animals in a colony of eusocial insects. Emulations that were wholly altruistic toward their copy siblings would cooperate with one another even in the absence of elaborate incentive schemes. Superorganisms would have a particularly strong advantage if non-consensual deletion or indefinite suspension, insisting on self-preservation, would be saddled with an unending commitment to pay upkeep for obsolete or redundant workers. In contrast, organizations whose emulations willingly deleted themselves when their services were no longer required could more easily adapt to fluctuations in demand, and they could experiment freely, proliferating variations of their workers and retaining only the most productive. If voluntary deletion is not disallowed, then the comparative advantage of eusocial emulations is reduced, though perhaps not eliminated. Employers of cooperative self-sacrificers might still reap efficiency gains from reduced agency problems through the organization, including being spared the trouble of having to defeat whatever resistance emulations could put up against their own deletion. In general, the productivity gains of having workers willing to sacrifice their individual lives for the common weal are a special case of the benefits an organization can derive from having members who are fanatically devoted to it. Such members would not only leap into the grave for the organization and work long hours for little pay, they would also shun office politics and try consistently to act in what they took to be the organization's best interest, reducing the need for supervision and bureaucratic constraints. If the only way to achieve such dedication were by restricting membership to copy siblings so that all emulations in a particular superorganism were stamped out from the same template, then superorganisms would suffer some disadvantage in being able to draw only from a range of skills narrower than that of rival organizations, a disadvantage which might or might not be large enough to outweigh the advantages of avoiding internal agency problems. This disadvantage would be greatly alleviated if a superorganism could at least contain members with different training, even if all its members were derived from a single year template. Its workforce could then still contribute a diversity of skills. Starting with a polymathically talented emulation year template, lineages could be branched off into different training programs, one copy learning accounting, another electrical engineering, and so forth. This would produce a membership with diverse skills, though not of diverse talents. Maximum diversity might require that more than one year template be used. The essential property of a superorganism is not that it consists of copies of a single progenitor, but that all the individual agents within it are fully committed to a common goal. The ability to create a superorganism can thus be viewed as requiring a partial solution to the control problem, whereas a completely general solution to the control problem would enable somebody to create an agent with an arbitrary final goal. The partial solution needed for the creation of a superorganism requires merely the ability to fashion multiple agents with the same final goal for some non-trivial, but not necessarily arbitrary, final goal. The main consideration put forward in this subsection is thus not really limited to monoclonal emulation groups, but can be stated more generally in a way that makes clear that it applies to a wide range of multipolar machine intelligence scenarios. It is that certain types of advances in motivation selection techniques, which may become feasible when the actors are digital, may help overcome some of the inefficiencies that currently hamper large human organizations and that counterbalance economies of scale. With these limits lifted, organizations, be they firms, nations, or other economic or political entities, could increase in size. This is one factor that could facilitate the emergence of a post-transition singleton. One area in which superorganisms or other digital agents with partially selected motivations might excel is coercion. A state might use motivation selection methods to ensure that its police, military, intelligence service, and civil administration are uniformly loyal. As Schulman notes, Save states of some loyal emulation that has been carefully prepared and verified could be copied billions of times to staff an ideologically uniform military, bureaucracy, and police force. After a short period of work, each copy would be replaced by a fresh copy of the same save state, preventing ideological shift, or drift. Within a given jurisdiction, this capability would allow incredibly detailed observation and regulation. There might be one such copy for every other resident. This could be used to prohibit the development of weapons of mass destruction, to enforce regulations on brain emulation, experimentation, or reproduction, to enforce a liberal democratic constitution, or to create an appalling and permanent totalitarianism. The first order effect of such a capability would seem to be to consolidate power, and possibly to concentrate it in fewer hands. Unification by treaty. There may be large potential gains to be had from international collaboration in a post-transition multipolar world. Wars and arms races could be avoided, astrophysical resources could be colonized and harvested at a globally optimum pace. The development of more advanced forms of machine intelligence could be coordinated to avoid a rush and to allow new designs to be thoroughly vetted. Other developments that might pose existential risks could be postponed, and uniform regulations could be enforced globally, including provisions for a guaranteed standard of living, which would require some form of population control, and for preventing exploitation and abuse of emulations and other digital and biological minds. Furthermore, agents with resource-satiable preferences, more on this in Chapter 13, would prefer a sharing agreement that would guarantee them a certain slice of the future to a winner-takes-all struggle in which they would risk getting nothing. The presence of big potential gains from collaboration, however, does not imply that collaboration will actually be achieved. In the world today, many great boons could be obtained via a better global coordination, reductions of military expenditures, wars, overfishing, trade barriers, and atmospheric pollution, among others. Yet these plump fruits are left to spoil in the branch. Why is that? What stops a fully cooperative outcome that would maximize the common good? One obstacle is the difficulty of ensuring compliance with any treaty that might be agreed, including monitoring and enforcement costs. Two nuclear rivals might each be better off if they both relinquished their atom bombs, yet even if they could reach an in-principle agreement to do so, disarmament could nevertheless prove elusive because of their mutual fear that the other party might cheat. Allaying this fear would require setting up a verification mechanism. There may have to be inspectors to oversee the destruction of existing stockpiles, and then to monitor nuclear reactors and other facilities, and to gather technical and human intelligence in order to ensure that the weapons program is not reconstituted. One cost is paying for these inspectors. Another cost is the risk that the inspectors will spy and make off with commercial or military secrets. Perhaps most significantly, each party might fear that the other will preserve a clandestine nuclear capability. Many a potentially beneficial deal never comes off because compliance would be too difficult to verify. If new inspection technologies that reduce monitoring costs become available, one would expect this to result in increased cooperation. Whether monitoring costs would on net be reduced in the post-transition era, however, is not entirely clear. While there would certainly be many powerful new inspection techniques, there would also be new means of concealment. In particular, an increasing portion of the activities one might want to regulate would be taking place in cyberspace, out of reach of physical surveillance. For example, digital minds working on designing a new nanotech weapon system on a new generation of artificial intelligence may do so without leaving much of a physical footprint. Digital forensics may fail to penetrate all layers of concealment and encryption in which a treaty violator might cloak its illicit activities. Reliable lie detection, if it could be developed, would be an extremely useful tool for monitoring compliance. An inspection protocol could include provisions for interviewing key officials to verify that they are intent on implementing all the provisions of the treaty and that they know of no violations despite making strong efforts to find out. A decision-maker planning to cheat may defeat such a lie detection-based verification scheme by first issuing orders to subordinates to undertake the illicit activity and to conceal the activity in from the decision-maker herself, and then subjecting herself to some procedures that erase her memory of having engaged in these machinations. Suitably targeted memory erasure operations might well be feasible in biological brains with more advanced neurotechnology. It might even be easier in machine intelligences, depending on their architecture. States could seek to overcome this problem by committing themselves to an ongoing monitoring scheme that regularly tests key officials with a lie detector to check whether they harbor any intent to subvert or circumvent any treaty to which the state has entered or may enter in the future. Such a commitment could be viewed as a kind of meta-treaty, which would facilitate the verification of other treaties, but states might commit themselves to it unilaterally to gain the benefit of being regarded as a trustworthy negotiation partner. However, this commitment or meta-treaty would face the same problem of subversion through a delegate and forget ploy. Ideally, the meta-treaty would be put into effect before any party had an opportunity to make the internal arrangements necessary to subvert its implementation. Once villainy has had an unguarded moment to sow its mines of deception, trust can never set foot there again. In some cases, the mere ability to detect treaty violations is sufficient to establish the confidence needed for a deal. In other cases, however, there is a need for some mechanism to enforce compliance or mete out punishment if a violation should occur. The need for an enforcement mechanism may arise if the threat of the wronged party withdrawing from the treaty is not enough to deter violations. For instance, if the treaty violator would gain such an advantage that he would not subsequently care how the other party responds. If highly effective motivation selection methods are available, this enforcement problem could be solved by empowering an independent agency with sufficient police or military strength to enforce the treaty, even against the opposition of one or several of its signatories. This solution requires that the enforcement agency can be trusted, but with sufficiently good motivation selection techniques, the requisite confidence might be achieved by having all the parties to the treaty jointly oversee the design of the enforcement agency. Handing over power to an external enforcement agency raises many of the same issues that we confronted earlier in our discussions of a unipolar outcome, one in which a singleton arises prior to or during the initial machine intelligence revolution. In order to be able to enforce treaties concerning the vital security interests of rival states, the external enforcement agencies would, in effect, need to constitute a singleton, a global superintelligent leviathan. One difference, however, is that we are now considering a post-transition situation in which the agents that would have to create this leviathan would have greater competence than we humans currently do. These leviathan creators may themselves already be superintelligent. This would greatly improve the odds that they could solve the control problem and design an enforcement agency that would serve the interests of all the parties that have a say in its construction. Aside from the costs of monitoring and enforcing compliance, are there any other obstacles to global coordination? Perhaps the major remaining issue is what we can refer to as bargaining costs. Even when there is a possible bargain that would benefit everybody involved, it sometimes does not get off the ground because the parties fail to agree on how to divide the spoils. For example, if two persons could make a deal that would net them $1 in profit, but each party feels she deserves 60 cents and refuses to settle for less, the deal will not happen and the potential gain will be forfeited. In general, negotiations can be difficult or protracted or remain altogether barren because of strategic bargaining choices made by some of the parties. In real life, human beings frequently succeed in reaching agreements despite the possibility for strategic bargaining, though often not without considerable expenditure of time and patience. It is conceivable, however, that strategic bargaining problems would have a different dynamic in the post-transition era. An AI negotiator might more consistently adhere to some particular formal conception of rationality, possibly with novel or unanticipated consequences when matched with other AI negotiators. An AI might also have available to it moves in the bargaining game that are either unavailable to humans or very much more difficult for humans to execute, including the ability to pre-commit to a policy or a course of action. While humans and human-run institutions are occasionally able to pre-commit with imperfect degrees of credibility and specificity, some types of machine intelligence might be able to make arbitrary, unbreakable pre-commitments, and to allow negotiating partners to confirm that such a pre-commitment has been made. The availability of powerful pre-commitment techniques could profoundly alter the nature of negotiations, potentially giving an immense edge to an agent that has a first-mover advantage. If a particular agent's participation is necessary for the realization of some prospective gains from cooperation, and if that agent is able to make the first move, it would be in a position to dictate the division of the spoils by pre-committing not to accept any deal that gives it less than, say, 99% of the surplus value. Other agents would then be faced with the choice of either getting nothing by rejecting the unfair proposal or getting 1% of the value by caving in. If the first moving agent's pre-commitment is publicly verifiable, its negotiating partner could be sure that these are their only two options. To avoid being exploited in this manner, agents might pre-commit to refuse blackmail and to decline all unfair offers. Once such pre-commitment has been made and successfully publicized, other agents would not find it in their interest to make threats or to pre-commit themselves to only accepting deals titled in tilted in their own favor because they would know that threats would fail and that unfair proposals would be rejected. But this just demonstrates again that the advantage is with the first mover. The agent who moves first can choose whether to parlay its position of strength only to deter others from taking unfair advantage, or to make a grab for the lion's share of future spoils. Best situated of all, it might seem, would be the agent who starts out with a temperament or a value system that makes him impervious to extortion, or indeed to any offer of a deal in which his participation is indispensable, but he is not getting almost all of the gains. Some humans seem already to possess personality traits corresponding to various aspects of an uncompromising spirit. A high-strung disposition, however, could backfire should it turn out that there are other agents around who feel entitled to more than their fair share, or are committed to not backing down. The unstoppable force would then encounter the unmovable object, resulting in a failure to reach agreement, or worse, total war. The meek and the acratic would at least get something, albeit less than their fair share. What kind of game-theoretic equilibrium would be reached in such a post-transition bargaining game is not immediately obvious. Agents might choose more complicated strategies than the ones considered here. One hopes that an equilibrium would be reached centered on some fairness norm that would serve as a shelling point, a salient feature in a big outcome space, which, because of shared expectations, becomes a likely coordination point in an otherwise underdetermined coordination game. Such an equilibrium might be bolstered by some of our evolved dispositions and cultural programming. A common preference for fairness could, assuming we succeed in transferring our lives into the post-transition era, bias expectations and strategies in ways that lead to an attractive equilibrium. In any case, the upshot is that with the possibility of strong and flexible forms of pre-commitment, outcomes of negotiations might take on an unfamiliar guise. Even if the post-transition era started out multipolar, it might be that a singleton would arise almost immediately as a consequence of a negotiated treaty that resolves all important goals, global coordination problems. Some transaction costs, perhaps including monitoring and enforcement costs, might plummet with the new technological capabilities available to advance machine intelligence. Other costs, in particular costs related to strategic bargaining, might remain significant. But however strategic bargaining affects the nature of the agreement that is reached, there is no clear reason why it would long delay the reaching of some agreement, if an agreement were ever reached. If no agreement is reached, then some form of fighting might take place. Neither one faction might win and form a singleton around the winning coalition, or the result might be an interminable conflict, in which case a singleton may never form and the overall outcome might fall terribly short of what could and should have been achieved if humanity and its descendants had acted in a more coordinated and cooperative fashion. We have seen that multipolarity, even if it could be achieved in a stable form, would not guarantee an attractive outcome. The original principal agent problem remains unsolved, and burying it under a new set of problems relating to post-transition global coordination failures may only make the situation worse. Let us therefore return to the question of how we could safely keep a single superintelligent AI. Chapter 12, Acquiring Values.
Okay, that was a long chapter. That was a very long chapter.
That was a very long chapter. Okay. When you got this, okay, thank you. But I will have to say, I do have to say, right? That chapter really lost me. Aren't you, Chipper? As always. That chapter kind of lost me. Like, I genuinely don't remember what the hell I read. I'm gonna be honest. It was so long, and like unification by treaty. It was like, I think this chapter was more focused on like the negotiations between like virtual AI with each other. Or was that the last one? That's two. Oh, yeah. So the Oracle chapter, that I understood. That made sense to me. But then I read this chapter, multipolar scenarios, where, you know, multiple agents in virtual worlds would, how would they feel if they had to work on a treadmill or something? I'm like, I don't, you've lost me. And then like towards near the end, it brought me back when he started talking about like super intelligences that are multipolar, that arise at the same time and compete with each other. But then they kind of just echo the same sentiments as the previous negotiation chapter. Like it feels like it was just his exercise in creative writing. Like, not that the arguments were not right. The arguments felt like they were rigorous enough, but they didn't feel like the microscopic arguments made sense, but the macro arguments like made no sense to me. The macro arguments is just like, I don't know, like I didn't really get it. Like that he analyzes a lot of social and economic issues as they relate to AI use. Yeah, for sure. Like he's definitely thinking about a lot of things. I would say he's not thinking of the whole thing, in that I think distinctively there is a missing. Actually, no, there isn't really much of a missing perspective I can voice right now. He really does consider, with a good amount of like breadth, most of the stakeholders and the people who'd be involved. In fact, I would say that he considers maybe too much, actually. I feel as though maybe just me, but he could actually cut down on it a bit. And, not really spend so much time talking about political military strategies. But maybe that's relevant, though. Maybe that's good. Maybe I just don't like it because I don't. I think it's sort of irrelevant to the discussion, but it is relevant. Like things are relevant. Nothing is irrelevant completely. Of course, things are related, but it's just. Anyways, let's continue. Let's continue. Whatever's happening in this book looks kind of spooky. It would be. It's spooky because like he's saying like there's gonna be super intelligence and it's gonna happen, and here's how it's gonna happen, and here's what that will look like, and here are some ways we can defend against it, and here are some ways why the way we defend against it might not be effective. It's spooky in that way. Though at the same time it's also kind of interesting or entertaining, and like if I just pretend like it's not real and like it's speculative science fiction, the idea is kind of neat, some of them. I didn't really think like, oh, what if we had virtual humans uploaded into a computer to do our work? But because they're in a virtual world, we can afford to put them in like a utopia or whatever perfect environment they want for their productivity to be like super perfect, right? Because it's so much cheaper. Couldn't we do that? Then people could just work in a utopian, like in a setting, like they can work at their hours and they can earn a livable wage, and then experience whatever the hell they want to experience if they're simulated. Could see the value loading being integrated with survival. After all, a lot of animal cognition is tied to surviving. Oh yeah, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. There's the survival bit of this is interesting because it does, I think when he asserts it in both the AI and like both the superintelligence and in AI that exists like virtually emulated like human-like beings, he does kind of put that, he does like postulate that, yeah, there is a strong motive for survival, but I can't see that yet, Like it makes sense for like it makes sense what he's saying. He's drawing the example with, peacocks and humans, or just like animals in general that can afford to do so. They can afford to, for mating purposes and the way that it's been passed down. Maybe Fi, you would have like found that more engaging, because I personally was like, I think I know what's going on, but it's tough. But like I just can't see an artificial being existing in that way unless we modeled it to be like that. And I don't know why we would model it to be like, I don't know why yet we would model something to self-preserve in our ways, like in the human, in like an biologically evolutionary way. I feel as though there should be more better ways of self-preservation that an AI would be programmed with, but I can't think of what that would be. I don't know. I can see survival as being the best value load for the AI, not necessarily for the benefit of humanity. It's, I think there was a chapter, what was it? Where was it? Yeah, the super intelligent will. This is where he kind of like really dives into it, right? Self-preservation. If an agent's final goals concern the future, then in many scenarios there will be future actions it could perform to increase the probability of its achieving its goals. This creates an instrumental reason for the agent to try to be around in the future to help achieve its future-oriented goal. So it's less so to like that cleared up a confusion for me, because initially I was like, well, why would the AI care about its life? You know, we didn't program it to do that. We programmed it to make paper clips or whatever. But then it's like cleared up because, well, the reason why it would care is because it has to be alive to make paper clips, and you are programming it to make paper clips, not for it to pave the way for something else, for paper clips to be made, which he will dive in, like, which I think he will get to in like a later chapter, right? I think like the criteria for choosing, maybe. Rationale, priority. It's like the indirect subjective thing is what he says. Maybe it's in this chapter, acquiring values, but yeah. But it's super like confusing. To, I guess, like, for me at least, to think, yeah, it would self-preserve and it would probably be similar in pattern to biological patterns we've observed, like in nature, which yeah, goal, content, integrity, cognitive enhancement, technological perfection, resource acquisition. Yep. Is it over? Did you read the whole book? No, not yet. I'm just discussing the previous chapter because I genuinely just could not wrap my head around it. Like, I was reading it and it was a long chapter. There were like many subheadings there. And I just lost consciousness as I was reading this. Like, I went into a flow state, and I think during this middle bit with like the AI slavery and casual death and maximally efficient work, I was just like, okay, you've lost me. Malthusian jump scare? Oh, yeah. The Malthusian principle. You missed it just now, but in the book just now, in the chapter just now, the Malthusian principle, what was it applied to? Like a virtual world with virtual computer things in them, or virtual computer beings in them, and how like there would eventually be a limit too because of computer hardware and stuff, even though like it seems as though it's much cheaper, and it is much cheaper to create virtual existences, or virtual workers that would, you know, solve equations for us or whatever. It gets a little sci-fi to me. But then they go like, then he goes like, well, it's going to encounter the same Malthusian principle and how that would work. Or like people who will be sent into VR. Like, I think it's a bit more relevant to my frame of thinking if when he says like, well, it's similar to people who are sent, maybe people who work via VR. That kind of makes sense to me. Oh, I don't know. Was that the chapter that just copied the Harlan Ellison short story? The No Mouth Scream? No, not quite. Though what it speculates on is overlaps. But yeah. All right, okay. I think I've kind of honed in on it. I think I've honed in on the chapter. So I had to take that break to really just discuss it and digest it. Normally I would just continue reading because I want generally reading streams to just be like me reading the stream on the stream. But that really required me to just think about. Okay, let's continue on. This is the last chapter. Chapter 12. Acquiring values. Capability control is at best a temporary and auxiliary measure. Unless the plan is to keep superintelligence bottled up forever, it will be necessary to master motivation selection. But just how could we get some value into an artificial agent so as to make it pursue that value as its final goal? While the agent is unintelligent, it might lack the capability to understand or even represent any humanly meaningful value. Yet if we delay the procedure until the agent is superintelligent, it may be able to resist our attempt to meddle with its motivation system, and as we showed in Chapter 7, it would have convergent instrumental reasons to do so. This value loading problem is tough, but must be confronted. Okay, so this is... okay. It is impossible to enumerate all possible situations a superintelligence might find itself in and to specify for each what action it should take. Similarly, it is impossible to create a list of all possible worlds and assign each of them a value. In any realm, significantly more complicated than a game of tic-tac-toe, there are far too many possible states and state histories for exhaustive enumeration to be feasible. A motivation system, therefore, cannot be specified as a comprehensive lookup table. It must indeed be expressed more abstractly, as a formula or rule that allows the agent to decide what to do in any given situation. One formal way of specifying such a decision rule is via a utility function. A utility function, as we recall from Chapter 1, assigns value to each outcome that might obtain, or more generally to each possible world. Given a utility function, one can define an agent that maximizes expected utility. Such an agent selects, at each time, the action that has the highest expected utility. The expected utility is calculated by weighing the utility of each possible world with the subjective probability of that world being the actual world conditional on a particular action being taken. In reality, the possible outcomes are too numerous for the expected utility of an action to be calculated exactly. Nevertheless, the decision rule and the utility function together determine a normative ideal, an optimality notion that an agent might be designed to approximate, and the approximation might get closer as the agent gets more intelligent. Creating a machine that can compute a good approximation of the expected utility of the actions available to it as an AI complete problem is an AI complete problem. This chapter addresses another problem, a problem that remains even if the problem of making machines intelligent is solved. We can use this framework of a utility maximizing agent to consider the predicament of a future seed AI programmer who intends to solve the control problem by endowing the AI with a final goal that corresponds to some plausible human notion of a worthwhile outcome. The programmer has some particular human value in mind that he would like the AI to promote. To be concrete, let us say that it is happiness. Similar issues would arise if the programmer were interested in justice, freedom, glory, human rights, democracy, ecological balance, or self-development. In terms of the expected utility framework, the programmer is thus looking for a utility function that assigns utility to possible worlds in proportion to the amount of happiness they contain. But how could he express such a utility function in computer code? Computer languages do not contain terms such as happiness as primitives. If such a term is to be used, it must first be defined. It is not enough to define it in terms of other high-level human concepts. Happiness is enjoyment of the potentialities inherent in our human nature, or some such philosophical paraphrase. The definition must bottom out in terms that appear in the AI's programming language, and ultimately in primitives, such as mathematical operators and addresses pointing out to the contents of individual memory registers. When one considers the problem from this perspective, one can begin to appreciate the difficulty of the programmer's task. Identifying and codifying our own final goals is difficult because human goal representations are complex. Because the complexity is largely transparent to us, however, we often fail to appreciate that it is there. We can compare the case to visual perception. Vision, likewise, might seem like a simple thing, because we do it effortlessly. We only need to open our eyes, so it seems, and a rich, meaningful, eidetic, three-dimensional view of the surrounding environment comes flooding into our minds. This intuitive understanding of vision is like a duke's understanding of his patriarchal household. As far as he is concerned, things simply appear at their appropriate times and places, while the mechanism that produces those manifestations are hidden from view. Yet accomplishing even the simplest visual task, finding the pepper jar in the kitchen, requires a tremendous amount of computational work. From a noisy time series of two-dimensional patterns of nerve firings originating in the retina and conveyed to the brain via the optic nerve, the visual cortex must work backwards to reconstruct an interpreted three-dimensional representation of external space. A sizable portion of our precious 1 square meter of cortical real estate, is zoned for processing visual information. And as you are reading this book, billions of neurons are working ceaselessly to accomplish this task, like so many seamstresses bent over their sewing machines in a sweatshop, sewing and resewing a giant quilt many times a second. In like manner, our seemingly simple values and wishes in fact contain immense complexity. How could our programmer transfer this complexity into a utility function? One approach could be to try to directly code a complete representation of whatever goal we have that we want the AI to pursue. In other words, to write down an explicit utility function. This approach might work if we had extraordinarily simple goals. For example, if we wanted to calculate the digits of pi, that is, if the only thing we wanted was for the AI to calculate the digits of pi, and we were indifferent to any other consequence that would result from the pursuit of this goal, recall our earlier discussion of the failure mode of infrastructure fusion. This explicit coding approach might also have some promise in the use of domesticity motivation selection methods. But if one seeks to promote or protect any plausible human value, and one is building a system intended to become a superintelligent sovereign, then explicitly coding the requisite complete goal representation appears to be hopelessly out of reach. If we cannot transfer human values into AI by typing out full-blown representations in computer code, what else might we try? This chapter discusses several alternative paths. Some of these may look plausible at first sight, but much less so upon closer examination. Future explorations should focus on these paths that remain open. Solving the value loading problem is a research challenge worthy of some of the next generation's best mathematical talent. We cannot postpone confronting this problem until the AI has developed enough reason to easily understand our intentions. As we saw in the section in Convergent Instrumental Reasons, a generic system will resist attempts to alter its final values. If an agent is not already fundamentally friendly by the time it gains the ability to reflect on its own agency, it will not take kindly to a belated attempt at brainwashing or plot to replace it with a different agent that better loves its neighbor. Evolutionary selection. Evolution has produced an organism with human values at least once. This fact might encourage the belief that evolutionary methods are a way to solve the value loading problem. There are, however, severe obstacles to achieving safety along this path. We have already pointed to these obstacles at the end of Chapter 10 when we discussed how powerful search processes can be dangerous. Evolution can be viewed as a particular class of search algorithms that involve the alternation of two steps, one expanding a population of solution candidates by generating new candidates according to some relatively simple stochastics rule, such as random mutation or sexual recombination, the other contracting the population by pruning candidates that score poorly when tested by an evaluation function. As with many other types of powerful search, there is the risk that the process will find a solution that satisfies the formally specified search criteria, but not our implicit expectations. This would hold whether one seeks to evolve a digital mind that has the same goals and values as a typical human being, or instead a mind that is, for instance, perfectly moral or perfectly obedient. The risk would be avoided if we could specify a formal search criterion that accurately represented all dimensions of our goal, rather than just one aspect of what we think we desire. But this is precisely the value loading problem, and it would of course beg the question in this context to assume that the problem is solved. There is a future problem. The total amount of suffering per year in the natural world is beyond all decent contemplation. During the minute that it takes me to compose this sentence, thousands of animals are being eaten alive, others are running for their lives, whimpering with fear. Others are being slowly devoured from within by rasping parasites, thousands of all kinds of dying of starvation, thirst, and disease. Even just within our species, 150,000 persons are destroyed each day, while countless more suffer an appalling array of torments and deprivations. Nature might be a great experimentalist, but one who would never pass muster with an ethics review board, contravening the Helsinki Declaration in every norm of moral decency, left, right, and center. It is important that we not gratuitously replicate such horrors in silico, mind crime seems especially difficult to avoid when evolutionary methods are used to produce human-like intelligence, at least if the process is meant to look anything like actual biological evolution. Reinforcement learning is an area of machine learning that studies techniques whereby agents can learn to maximize some notion of cumulative reward. By constructing an environment in which desired performance is rewarded, a reinforcement learning agent can be made to learn to solve a wide class of problems, even in the absence of detailed instruction or feedback from the programmers, aside from the reward signal. Often, the learning algorithm involves the gradual construction of some kind of evaluation function, which assigns values to states, state action pairs, or policies. For instance, a program can learn to play backgammon by using reinforcement learning to incrementally improve its evaluation of possible board positions. The evaluation function, which is continuously updated in light of experience, could be regarded as incorporating a form of learning about value. However, what is being learned is not new, final values, but increasingly accurate estimates of the instrumental values of reaching particular states, or of taking particular actions in particular states, or of following particular policies. Insofar as a reinforcement learning agent can be described as having a final goal, that goal remains constant, to maximize future reward. And reward consists of specifically designated percepts received from the environment. Therefore, the wireheading syndrome remains a likely outcome in any reinforcement agent that develops a world model sophisticated enough to suggest this alternative way of maximizing reward. These remarks do not imply that reinforcement learning methods could never be used in a safe seed AI, only that they would have to be subordinated to a motivation system that is not itself organized around the principle of reward maximization. That, however, would require that a solution to the value loading problem had been found by some other means, than reinforcement learning. Associative value accretion. Now one might wonder, if the value loading problem is so tricky, how do we ourselves manage to acquire our values? One possible oversimplified model might look something like this. We begin life with some relatively simple starting preferences, e.g. an aversion to noxious stimuli, together with a set of dispositions to acquire additional preferences in response to various possible experiences. We might, for example, be disposed to form a preference for objects and behaviors that we find to be valued and rewarded in our culture. Both the simple starting preferences and the dispositions are innate, having been shaped by natural and sexual selection over evolutionary timescales. Yet which preferences we end up with as adults depends on life events. Much of the information content in our final values is thus acquired from our experiences rather than preloaded in our genomes. For example, many of us love another person and thus place great final value on his or her well-being. What is required to represent such a value? Many elements are involved, but consider just two: a representation of person and a representation of well-being. These concepts are not directly coded in our DNA, rather the DNA contains instructions for building a brain which, when placed in a typical human environment, will over the course of several years develop a world model that includes concepts of persons and of well-being. Once formed, these concepts can be used to represent certain meaningful values, but some mechanism needs to be innately present that leads to values being formed around these concepts, rather than around other acquired concepts like that of a flower pot or a corkscrew. The details of how this mechanism works are not well understood. In humans, the mechanism is probably complex and multifarious. It is easier to understand the phenomenon if we consider it in a more rudimentary form, such as filial imprinting in nidifugus birds, where the newly hatched chicks acquires a desire for physical proximity to an object that presents a suitable moving stimulus within the first day after hatching. Which particular object the chick desires to be near depends on its experience. Only the general disposition to imprint in this way is genetically determined. Analogously, Harry might place a final value on Sally's well-being, but had the twain never met, he might have fallen in love with somebody else instead, and his final values would have been different. The ability of our genes to code for the construction of a goal-acquiring mechanism explains how we come to have final goals of great informational complexity, greater than could be contained in the genome itself. We may consequently consider whether we might build the motivation system for an artificial intelligence on the same principle. That is, instead of specifying complex values directly, could we specify some mechanism that leads to the acquisition of those values when the AI interacts with a suitable environment? Mimicking the value accretion process that takes place in humans seems difficult. The relevant genetic mechanism in humans is the product of eons of work by evolution, work that might be hard to recapitulate. Moreover, the mechanism is presumably closely tailored to the human neurocognitive architecture and therefore not applicable in machine intelligences other than whole brain emulations. And if whole brain emulations of sufficient fidelity were available, it would seem easier to start with an adult brain that comes with full representations of some human values preloaded. Seeking to implement a process of value accretion closely mimicking that of human biology, therefore, seems an unpromising line of attack on the value loading problem. But perhaps we might design a more unabashedly artificial substitute mechanism that would lead an AI to import high-fidelity representations of relevant complex values into its goal system. For this to succeed, it may not be necessary to give the AI the exact same evaluative dispositions as a biological human. That may not even be desirable as an aim. Human nature, after all, is flawed and all too often reveals a proclivity to evil which would be intolerable in any system poised to attain a decisive strategic advantage. Better, perhaps, to aim for a motivation system that departs from the human norm in systematic ways, such as by having a more robust tendency to acquire final goals that are altruistic, compassionate, or high-minded in ways we would recognize as reflecting exceptionally good character if they were present in human person. To count as improvements, however, such deviations from the human norm would have to be pointed in very particular directions rather than at random, and they would continue to presuppose the existence of a large, undisturbed anthropocentric frame of reference to provide humanly meaningful evaluative generalizations, so as to avoid the kind of perverse instantiation of superficiality plausible goal descriptions that we examined in Chapter 8. It is an open question whether this is feasible. One further issue with associative value accretion is that the AI might disable the accretion mechanism. As we saw in Chapter 7, goal system integrity is a convergent instrumental value. When the AI reaches a certain stage of cognitive development, it may start to regard the continued operation of the accretion mechanism as a corrupting influence. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but care would have to be taken to make the sealing up of the goal system occur at the right moment, after the appropriate values have been accreted, but before they have been overwritten by additional unintended accretions. Motivational scaffolding. Another approach to the value loading problem is what we may refer to as motivational scaffolding. It involves giving the seed AI an interim goal system with relatively simple final goals that we can represent by means of explicit coding or some other feasible method. Once the AI has developed more sophisticated representational faculties, we replace this interim scaffold goal system with one that has different final goals. This successor goal system that then governs the AI as it develops into a full-blown superintelligence. Because the scaffold goals are not just instrumental but final goals for the AI might be expected to resist having them replaced, goal contingent integrity being a convergent instrumental value. This creates a hazard. If the AI succeeds in thwarting the replacement of its scaffold goals, the method fails. To avoid this failure mode, precautions are necessary. For example, capability control methods could be applied to limit the AI's powers until the mature motivation system has been installed. In particular, one could try to stunt its cognitive development at a level that is safe, but that allows it to represent the values that we want to include in its ultimate goals. To do this, one might try to differentially stunt certain types of intellectual abilities, such as those required for strategizing and Machiavellian scheming, while allowing apparently more innocuous abilities to develop to a somewhat higher level. One could also try to use motivation selection methods to induce a more collaborative relationship between the seed AI and the programmer team. For example, one might include in the scaffold motivation system the goal of welcoming online guidance from the programmers, including allowing them to replace any of the AI's current goals. Other scaffold goals might include being transparent to the programmers about its values and strategies, and developing an architecture that is easy for programmers to understand and that facilitates the later implementation of a humanly meaningful final goal, as well as domesticity motivations, such as limiting the use of computational resources. One could even imagine endowing the seed AI with the sole final goal of replacing itself with a different final goal, one which may have only been implicitly or indirectly specified by the programmers. Some of the issues raised by the use of such a self-replacing scaffold goal also arise in the context of the value learning approach, which is discussed in this next subsection. Some further issues discussed and raised in Chapter 13. The motivational scaffolding approach is not without downsides. One is that it carries the risk that the AI could become too powerful while it is still running on its interim goal system. It may then thwart the human programmer's efforts to install the ultimate goal system, either by forceful resistance or by quiet subversion. The old final goals may then remain in charge as the seed AI develops into a full-blown superintelligence. Another downside is that installing the ultimately intended goals in a human-level AI is not necessarily that much easier than doing so in a more primitive AI. A human-level AI is more complex and might have developed an architecture that is opaque and difficult to alter. A seed AI, by contrast, is like a tabula rasa, on which the programmers can inscribe whatever structures they deem helpful. This downside could be flipped into an upside if one succeeded in giving the seed AI scaffold goals that made it want to develop an architecture helpful to the programmers in their later efforts to install the ultimate final values. However, it is unclear how easy it would be to give a seed AI scaffolds goals with this property, and it is also unclear how even an ideally motivated seed AI would be capable of doing a much better job than the human programming team at developing a good architecture. We come now to an important but subtle approach to the value loading problem. It involves using the AI's intelligence to learn the values we wanted to pursue. To do this, we must provide a criterion for the AI that at least implicitly picks out some suitable set of values. We could then build the AI to act according to its best estimates of these implicitly defined values. It would continually refine its estimates as it learns more about the world and gradually unpacks the implications of the value-determining criterion. In contrast to the scaffolding approach, which gives the AI an interim scaffold goal and later replaces it with a different final goal, the value-learning approach retains an unchanging final goal through the AI's developmental and operational phases. Learning does not change the goal, it changes only the AI's beliefs about the goal. The AI thus must become endowed with a criterion that it can use to determine which percepts constitute evidence in favor of some hypothesis about what the ultimate goal is, and which percepts constitute evidence against. Specifying a suitable criterion could be difficult. Part of the difficulty, however, pertains to the problem of creating artificial general intelligence in the first place, which requires a powerful learning mechanism that can discover the structure of the environment from limited sensory inputs. That problem we can set aside here, but even modulo a solution to how to create superintelligent AI, there remains the difficulties that arise specifically from the value loading problem. With a value learning approach, these take the form of needing to define a criterion that connects perceptual bit strings to hypotheses about values. Before delving into the details of how value learning could be implemented, it might be helpful to illustrate the general idea with an example. Suppose we write down a description of a set of values on a piece of paper. We fold the paper and put it in a sealed envelope. We then create an agent with human-level general intelligence and give it the following final goal. Maximize the realization of the values described in the envelope. What will this agent do? The agent does not initially know what is written in the envelope, but it can form hypotheses, and it can assign those hypotheses probabilities based on their priors and any available empirical data. For instance, the agent might have encountered other examples of human-authored texts, or it might have observed some general patterns of human behavior. This would enable it to make guesses. One does not need a degree in psychology to predict that the note is more likely to describe a value such as minimize injustice and unnecessary suffering or maximize returns to shareholders than a value such as cover all lakes with plastic shopping bags. When the agent makes a decision, it seeks to take actions that would be effective at realizing the values it believes are most likely to be described in the letter. Importantly, the agent would see a high instrumental value in learning more about what the letter says. The reason is that for almost any final value that might be described in the letter, that value is more likely to be realized if the agent finds out what it is, since the agent will then pursue that value more effectively. The agent would also discover the convergent instrumental reasons described in Chapter 7. Goal system integrity, cognitive enhancement, resource acquisition, and so forth. Yet, assuming that the agent assigns a sufficiently high probability to the values described in the letter involving human welfare, it would not pursue these instrumental values by immediately turning the planet into computronium and thereby exterminating the human species, because doing so would risk permanently destroying its ability to realize its final value. We can liken this kind of agent to a barge attached to several tugboats that pull in different directions. Each tugboat corresponds to a hypothesis about the agent's final value. The engine power of each tugboat corresponds to the associated hypothesis probability and thus changes as new evidence comes in, producing adjustments in the barge's direction of motion. The resultant force should move the barge along a trajectory that facilitates learning about the implicit final value while avoiding the shoals of irreversible destruction, and later, when the open sea of more definitive knowledge of the final value is reached, the one tugboat that still exerts significant force will pull the barge toward the realization of the discovered value along the straightest or most propitious route. The envelope and barge metaphors illustrate the principle underlying value learning approach. But they pass over a number of critical technical issues. They come into clearer focus once we start to develop the approach within a formal framework. See Box 10. One outstanding issue is how to endow the AI with a goal such as maximize the realization of the values described in the envelope. In the terminology of Box 10, how to define the value criterion. To do this, it is necessary to identify the places where the values are described. In our example, this requires making a successful reference to the letter in the envelope. Though this might seem trivial, it is not without pitfalls. To mention just one, it is critical that the reference be not simply to a particular external physical object, but to an object at a particular time. Otherwise, the AI might determine that the best way to attain its goal is by overriding the original value description with one that provides an easier target, such as the value that for every integer there be a larger integer. This done, the AI could lean back and crack its knuckles, though more likely a malignant failure would ensue for reasons we discuss in Chapter 8. So now we face the question of how to define time. We could point to a clock and say, time is defined by the movements of this device. But this could fail if the AI conjectures that it can manipulate time by moving the hands on the clock, a conjecture which would indeed be correct if time were given the aforesaid definition. In a realistic case, matters would be further complicated by the fact that relevant values are not going to be conveniently described in a letter. More likely, they would have to be inferred from observations of pre-existing structures that implicitly contain the relevant information, such as human brains. Box 10. Formalizing value learning. Introducing some formal notation can help us see some things more clearly. However, readers who dislike formalism can skip this part. Okay. I'm going to skip the equations, but I'll try to read out this bit. Consider a simplified framework in which an agent interacts with its environment in a finite number of discrete cycles. In cycle k, the agent performs action yk and then receives the percept xk. The interaction history of an agent with lifespan m is a string y1, x1, y2, x2, which we can abbreviate as yx1m or yx. Okay. In each cycle, the agent selects an action based on the percept sequence it has received to date. Consider first a reinforcement learner. An optimal reinforcement learner is one that maximizes expected future rewards. It obeys the equation here. So this is the expected rewards maximizing equation. Okay. The reward sequence is implied by the percept sequence, since the reward that the agent receives in a given cycle is part of the percept that the agent receives in that cycle. As argued earlier, this kind of reinforcement learning is unsuitable in the present context, because a sufficiently intelligent agent will realize that it could secure maximum reward if it were able to directly manipulate its reward signal, wireheading. For weak agents, this need not be a problem, since we can physically prevent them from tampering with their own reward channel. We can also control their environment so that they receive rewards only when they act in ways that are agreeable to us. But a reinforcement learner has a strong incentive to eliminate this artificial dependence of its rewards on our whims and wishes. Our relationship with a reinforcement learner is therefore fundamentally antagonistic. If the agent is strong, this spells danger. Variations of the wireheading syndrome can also affect systems that do not seek an external sensory reward signal, but whose goals, are defined as the attainment of some internal state. For example, in so-called actor-critic systems, there is an actor module that selects actions in order to maximize the disapproval of a separate critic module that computes how far the agent's behavior falls short of a given performance measure. The problem with this setup is that the actor module may realize that it can minimize disapproval by modifying the critic or eliminating it altogether, much like a dictator who dissolves the parliament and nationalizes the press. For limited systems, the problem can be avoided simply by not giving the actor module any means of modifying the critic module. A sufficiently intelligent and resourceful actor module, however, could always gain access to the critic module, which after all is merely a physical process in some computer. Before we get to the value learner, let's consider as an intermediary step what has been called an observation utility maximizer. It is obtained by replacing the reward series in the AIRL with a utility function that is allowed to depend on the entire future interaction history of the AI. This formulation provides a way around the wireheading problem because a utility function defined over an entire interaction history could be designed to penalize interaction histories that show signs of self-deception, or a failure on the part of the agent to invest sufficiently in obtaining an accurate view of reality. The AIOM thus makes it possible in principle to circumvent the wireheading problem. Availing ourselves of this possibility, however, would require that we specify a suitable utility function over the class of possible interaction histories, a task that looks forbiddingly difficult. It may be more natural to specify utility functions directly in terms of possible worlds, or properties of possible worlds, or theories about the world, rather than in terms of an agent's own interaction histories. If we use this approach, we could reformulate and simplify the AIOUM optimality notion. Here, E is the total evidence available to the agent at the time when it is making its decision, and U is a utility function that assigns utility to some class of possible worlds. The optimal agent chooses the act that maximizes expected penalty. An outstanding problem with these formulations is the difficulty of defining the utility function U. This finally returns us to the value loading problem. To enable the utility function to be learned, we must expand our formalism to allow for uncertainty over utility functions. This can be done as follows. Here, V is a function from utility functions to propositions about utility functions. VU is the proposition that the utility function U satisfies the value criterion expressed by V. To decide which action to perform, one could hence proceed as follows. First, compute the conditional probability of each possible world, W, given available evidence and on the supposition that action Y is to be performed. Second, for each possible utility function U, compute the conditional probability that U satisfies the value criterion V. Conditional on W being the actual world. Third, for each possible utility function U, compute the utility of possible world with W. Fourth, combine the quantities to compute the expected utility of action Y. Fifth, repeat the procedure for each possible action and perform the action found to have the highest expected utility using some arbitrary method to break ties as described. This procedure, which involves giving explicit and separate consideration to each possible world, is of course wildly computationally intractable. The AI would have to use computational shortcuts that approximate this optimality notion. The question then is how to define this value criterion V. Once the AI has an adequate representation of the value criterion, it could in principle use its general intelligence to gather information about which possible worlds are most likely to be developed than the actual one. It could then apply the criterion for each such plausible possible world W to find out which utility function satisfies the criterion in W. One can thus regard the AIVL formula as a way of identifying and separating out this key challenge in the value learning approach, the challenge of how to represent V. The formalism also brings to light a number of other issues, such as how to define Y, W, and U, which would need to be resolved before the approach could be made to work. Okay. Another issue in coding the... Excuse me, let me drink some water. Another issue in coding the goal, maximize the realization of the values described in the envelope, is that even if all the correct values were described in a letter, and even if the AI's motivation system were successfully keyed to this source, the AI might not interpret the descriptions the way we intended. This would create a risk of perverse instantiation, such as what was discussed in Chapter 8. To clarify, the difficulty here is not so much how to ensure that the AI can understand human intentions. A superintelligence could easily develop such understanding. Rather, the difficulty is ensuring that the AI will be motivated to pursue the described values in the way we intended. This is not guaranteed by the AI's ability to understand our intentions. An AI could know exactly what we meant and yet be indifferent to that interpretation of our words, being motivated instead by some other interpretation of the words, or being indifferent to our words altogether. The difficulty is compounded by the desideratum that, for reasons of safety, the correct motivation should ideally be installed in the seed AI before it becomes capable of fully representing human concepts or understanding human intentions. This requires that somehow a cognitive framework be created, with a particular location in that framework designated in the AI's motivation system as the repository of its final value. But the cognitive framework itself must be revisable, so as to allow the AI to expand its representational capacities as it learns more about the world and grows more intelligent. The AI might undergo the equivalent of scientific revolutions in which its worldview is shaken up, and it perhaps suffers ontological crises in which it discovers that its previous ways of thinking about values were based on confusions and illusions. Yet starting at a subhuman level of development and continuing throughout all its subsequent development into a galactic superintelligence, the AI's conduct is to be guided by an essentially unchanging final value, a final value that becomes better understood by the AI in direct consequence of its general intellectual progress, and likely quite differently understood by the mature AI than it was by its original programmers, though not different in a random or hostile way, but in a benignly appropriate way. How to accomplish this remains an open question. In summary, it is not yet known how to use the value learning approach to install plausible human values, though see box 12 for some recent examples. At present, the approach should be viewed as a research program rather than an available technique. If it could be made to work, it might constitute the most ideal solution to the value loading problem. Among other benefits, it would seem to offer a natural way to prevent mind crime, since a seed AI that makes reasonable guesses about which values its programmers might have installed would anticipate that mind crime is probably negatively evaluated by those values, and thus best avoided, at least until more definitive information has been obtained. Last but not least, there is a question of what to write in the envelope, or less metaphorically, the question of which values we should try to get the AI to learn. But this issue is common to all approaches to the AI value loading problem. We return to it in Chapter 13. Box 11, an AI that wants to be friendly. Eliezer Yudkowsky has tried to describe some features of a seed AI architecture intended to enable the kind of behavior described in the text above. In his terminology, the AI could use external reference semantics to illustrate the basic idea. Let us suppose that we want the system to be friendly. The system starts out with the goal of trying to instantiate property f, but does not initially know much about what f is. It might just know that f is some abstract property, and that when the programmers speak of friendliness, they are probably trying to convey information about f. Since the AI's final goal is to instantiate f, an important instrumental value is to learn more about what f is. As the AI discovers more about f, its behavior is increasingly guided by the actual content of f. Thus, hopefully, the AI becomes increasingly friendly the more it learns and the smarter it gets. The programmers can help this process along and reduce this risk of the AI making some catastrophic mistake while its understanding of f is still incomplete by providing the AI with programmer affirmations, hypotheses about the nature and content of f, to which an initially high probability is assigned. For instance, the hypothesis misleading the programmers is unfriendly can be given at higher prior probability. These programmer affirmations, however, are not true by definition. They are not unchallengeable axioms about the concept of friendliness. Rather, they are initial hypotheses about friendliness, hypotheses to which a rational AI will assign a high probability at least for as long as it trusts the programmer's epistemic capacities more than its own. Yudkowsky's proposal also involves the use of what he called causal validity semantics. The idea here is that the AI should do not exactly what the programmers told it to do, but rather something like what they were trying to tell it to do. While the programmers are trying to explain to the seed AI what friendliness is, they might make errors in their explanations. Moreover, the programmers themselves may not fully understand the true nature of friendliness. One would therefore want the AI to have the ability to correct errors in the programmer's thinking and to infer the true or intended meaning from whatever imperfect explanations the programmers manage to provide. For example, the AI should be able to represent the causal processes whereby the programmers learn and communicate about friendliness. Thus, to pick a trivial example, the AI should understand there is a possibility that a programmer might make a typo while inputting information about friendliness, and the AI should then seek to correct the error. More generally, the AI should seek to correct for whatever distortive influences may have corrupted the flow of information about friendliness as it passed from its source through the programmers to the AI, where distortive is an epistemic category. Ideally, as the AI matures, it should overcome any cognitive biases and other more fundamental misconceptions that may have prevented its programmers from fully understanding what friendliness is. Box 12, two recent half-baked ideas. What we might call the Hail Mary approach is based on the hope that elsewhere in the universe there exists, or will come to exist, civilizations that successfully manage the intelligence explosion, and that they end up with values that significantly overlap with our own. We could then try to build our AI so that it's motivated to do what these other superintelligences want to do. The advantage is that this might be easier than to build our AI to be motivated to do what we want directly. For this scheme to work, it is not necessary that our AI can establish communication with any alien superintelligence. Rather, our AI's actions would be guided by its estimates of what the AI or the alien superintelligences would want it to do. Our AI would model the likely outcomes of intelligence explosions elsewhere, and as it becomes superintelligent itself, its estimates should become increasingly accurate. Perfect knowledge is not required. There may be a range of plausible outcomes of intelligence explosions, and our AI would then do its best to accommodate the preferences of the various different kinds of superintelligence that might emerge, weighted by probability. This version of the Hail Mary approach requires that we construct a final value for our AI that refers to the preferences of other superintelligences. Exactly how to do this is not yet clear. However, superintelligent agents might be structurally distinctive enough that we would write a piece of code that would function as a detector that would look at the world model in our developing AI and designate the representational elements that correspond to the presence of a superintelligence. The detector would then, somehow, extract the presence of a superintelligence. The detector would then somehow extract the preferences of the superintelligence in question as it is represented within our own AI. If we could create such a detector, we could then use it to define our AI's final values. One challenge is that we may need to create the detector before we know what representational framework our AI will develop. The detector may thus need to query an unknown representational framework and extract the preferences of whatever superintelligence may be represented therein. This looks difficult, but perhaps some clever solution can be found. If the basic setup could be made to work, various refinements immediately suggest themselves. For example, rather than aiming to follow some weighted composition of the preferences of every alien superintelligence, our AI's final value could incorporate a filter to select a subset of alien superintelligences for obeisance, with the aim of selecting one whose values are closer to our own. For instance, we might use criteria pertaining to a superintelligence's causal origin to determine whether to include it in the obeisance set. Certain properties of its origination, which we might be able to define in structural terms, may correlate with the degree to which the resultant superintelligence could be expected to share our values. Perhaps we wish to place more trust in superintelligences whose causal origins trace back to a whole brain emulation, or to a seed AI that did not make heavy use of evolutionary algorithms, or that emerged slowly in a way suggestive of a controlled takeoff. Taking causal origins into account would also let us avoid overweighting superintelligences that create multiple copies of themselves. Indeed, would let us avoid creating an incentive for them to do so. Many other refinements would also be possible. The Hail Mary approach requires faith that there are other superintelligences out there that sufficiently share our values. This makes the approach non-ideal. However, the technical obstacles facing the Hail Mary approach, although very substantial, might possibly be less formidable than those confronting alternative approaches. Exploring non-ideal but more easily implementable approaches can make sense, not with the intention of using them, but to have something to fall back upon in case an ideal solution should not be ready in time. Another idea for how to solve the value loading problem has recently been proposed by Paul Cristiano. Like the Hail Mary, it is a value learning method that tries to define the value criterion by means of a trick, rather than through laborious construction. By contrast to the Hail Mary, it does not presuppose the existence of superintelligent agents that we could point to as role models for our own AI. Cristiano's proposal is somewhat resistant to brief explanation. It involves a series of arcane considerations, but we can try to at least gesture at its main elements. Suppose we could obtain a mathematically precise specification of a particular human brain, and b, a mathematically well-specified virtual environment that contains an idealized computer with an arbitrarily large amount of memory and CPU power. Given A and B, we could define a utility function U as the output the human brain would produce after interacting with this environment. U would be a mathematically well-defined object, albeit one which, because of computational limitations, we may be unable to describe explicitly. Nevertheless, U could serve as the value criterion for a value-learning AI, which could use various heuristics for assigning probabilities to hypotheses about what U implies. Intuitively, we want U to be the utility function that a suitably prepared human would output if she had the advantage of being able to use an arbitrarily large amount of computing power, enough computing power, for example, to run astronomical numbers of copies of herself to assist her with her analysis of specifying a utility function or to help her devise a better process for going about this analysis. We are here foreshadowing a theme, coherent extrapolated volition, which will be further explored in Chapter 13. It would seem relatively easy to specify the idealized environment. We can give a mathematical description of an abstract computer with arbitrarily large capacity, and in other respects, we could use a virtual reality program that gives a mathematical description of, say, a single room with a computer terminal in it, instantiating the abstract computer. But how to obtain a mathematically precise description of a particular human brain? The obvious way would be through the whole brain emulation, but what if the technology for emulation is not available in time? This is where Cristiano's proposal offers a key innovation. Cristiano observes that in order to obtain a mathematically well-specified value criterion, we need not practically a useful computational model of a mind, a model we could run. We just need a possibly implicit and hopelessly complicated mathematical definition, and this may be much easier to attain. Using functional neuroimaging and other measurements, we can perhaps collect gigabytes of data about the input and output behavior of a selected human. If we collect a sufficient amount of data, then it might be that the simplest mathematical model that accounts for all this data is in fact an emulation of the particular human in question. Although it would be computationally intractable for us to find this simplest model from the data, it could be perfectly possible for us to define the model by referring to the data and using a mathematically well-defined simplicity measure, such as some variant of the Kolmogorov complexity, which we encountered in Box 1, Chapter 1. Emulation modulation. The value loading problems look somewhat different for our whole brain emulation than it does for artificial intelligence. Methods that presuppose a fine-grained understanding and control of algorithms and architecture are not applicable to emulations. On the other hand, the augmentation motivation selection method, inapplicable to de novo artificial intelligence, is available to be used with emulations or enhanced biological brains. The augmentation method can be combined with techniques to tweak the inherited goals of the system. For example, one could try to manipulate the motivational state of an emulation by administering the digital equivalent of psychoactive substances, or in the case of biological systems, the actual chemicals. Even now, it is possible to pharmacologically manipulate values and motivations to a limited extent. The pharmacopoeia of the future may contain drugs with more specific and predictable effects. The digital medium of emulation should greatly facilitate such developments by making controlled experimentation easier and by rendering all cerebral parts directly addressable. Just as when biological test subjects are used, research on emulations would get entangled in ethical complications, not all of which would be brushed aside with a consent form. Such entanglements could slow progress along the emulation path because of regulation and/or moral constraint, perhaps especially hindering studies on how to manipulate the motivational structure of emulations. The result could be that emulations are augmented to potentially dangerous superintelligent levels of cognitive ability before adequate work has been done to test or adjust their final goals. Another possible effect of the moral entanglements might be to give the lead to less scrupulous teams and nations. Conversely, were we to relax our moral standards for experimenting with digital minds, we could become responsible for a substantial amount of harm and wrongdoing, which is obviously undesirable. Other things equal, these considerations favor taking some alternative path that does not require the extensive use of digital human research subjects in a strategically high-stakes situation. The issue, however, is not clear-cut. One could argue that whole brain emulation research is less likely to involve moral violations than artificial intelligence research, on the grounds that we are more likely to recognize when an emulation mind qualifies for moral status that we are to recognize when a completely alien or synthetic mind does so. If certain kinds of AIs, or their sub-processes, have a significant moral status that we fail to recognize, the consequent moral violations could be extensive. Consider, for example, the happy abandon with which contemporary programmers create reinforcement learning agents and subject them to aversive stimuli. Countless such agents are created daily, not only in computer science laboratories, but in many applications, including some computer games containing sophisticated non-player characters. Presumably, these agents are still too primitive to have any moral status, but how confident can we really be that this is so? More importantly, how confident can we be that we will know to stop in time before our programs become capable of experiencing morally relevant suffering? We will return in Chapter 14 to some of the broader strategic questions that arise when we compare the desirability of emulation and artificial intelligence paths. Institution design. Some intelligent systems consist of intelligent parts that are themselves capable of agency. Firms and states exemplify this in human world. Whilst largely composed of humans, they can, for some purposes, be viewed as autonomous agents in their own right. The motivations of such composite systems depend not only on the motivations of their constituent subagents, but also on how these subagents are organized. For instance, a group that is organized under strong dictatorship might behave as if it had a will that was identical to the will of the subagent that occupies the dictator role. Whereas a democratic group might sometimes behave more as if it had a will that was a composite, or average of the wills of its various constituents. But one can also imagine governance institutions that would make an organization behave in a way that is not a simple function of the wills of its subagents. Theoretically, at least, there could exist a totalitarian state that everybody hated, because the state, had mechanisms to prevent its citizens from coordinating a revolt. Each citizen could be worse off by revolting alone than by playing their part in the state machinery. By designing appropriate institutions for a composite system, one could try to shape its effective motivation. In Chapter 9, we discussed social integration as a possible capability control method. But there, we focused on the incentives faced by an agent as a consequence of its existence in a social world of near equals. Here, we are focusing on what happens inside a given agent, how its will is determined by its internal organization. We are therefore looking at a motivation selection method. Moreover, since this kind of internal institution design does not depend on large-scale social engineering or reform, it is a method that might be available to an individual project developing superintelligence, even if the wider socioeconomic or international milieu is less than ideally favorable. Institution design is perhaps most plausible in contexts where it would be combined with augmentation. If we could start with agents that are already suitably motivated or that have human-like motivations, institutional arrangements could be used as an extra safeguard to increase the chances that the system will stay on course. For example, suppose that we start with some well-motivated human-like agents, let us say emulations. We want to boost the cognitive capacities of these agents, but we worry that the enhancements might corrupt their motivations. One way to deal with this challenge would be to set up a system in which individual emulations function as subagents. When a new enhancement is introduced, it is first applied to a small subset of subagents. Its effects are then studied by a review panel composed of subagents who have not yet had the enhancement applied to them. Only when these peers have satisfied themselves that the enhancement is not corrupting is it rolled out to the wider subagent population. If the enhanced subagents are found to be corrupted, they are not given further enhancements and are excluded from key decision-making functions, at least until the system as a whole has advanced to a point where the corrupted subagents can be safely reintegrated. Although the corrupted subagents might have gained some advantage from the enhancement, the institutional structure in which they are embedded, and the fact that they constitute a small minority of all subagents, would hopefully prevent them from seizing power or spreading their corruption to the overall system. Thus, the collective intelligence and capability of the system could be gradually enhanced in a sequence of small steps, where the soundness of each step is verified by subagents only slightly less capable than the new subagents that are introduced in that step. The amount of safety obtainable by this kind of institution design is limited by the accuracy of the tests that are used to evaluate the enhanced subagents. The problem of test construction is complicated by the fact that the test batteries could only be validated within the pre-existing range of cognitive ability, yet must be applied to agents outside this range. One could mitigate this problem by taking small enhancement steps and by letting the test run for a long time. Such caution, however, would raise the cost and slow progress, which, if a race dynamic is occurring, could mean a project employing these safety measures would place itself at a disadvantage. Even with small steps and extensive testing, there would remain some risk of subtle flaws being introduced, leading to a gradual corruption of the goal system, a corruption that might become manifest only when the system reaches superintelligence. This risk could be reduced by letting the testing condition extend for many steps of cognitive enhancement, so that even agents that have been initially certified as sound and that have received several subsequent enhancements would continue to be under review by a panel of unmodified and uncorrupted original peers, and would remain subject to reversion. Ideally, the testing should be ongoing rather than confined to an initial evaluation period. Human-level subagents have the ability to strategize and might thus choose to conceal certain goals while their behavior was being monitored. To enable continuous testing, a hierarchy must be created in which subagents are at a certain level of capability are tasked with monitoring subagents at a somewhat higher level of capability. At the bottom of the capability hierarchy, but at the top of the power hierarchy, would sit the relatively dumb and slow principal. This human principal would be like a demented king who reigns over an incompetent court that oversees a mediocre administration which governs a capable people. Alternatively, he might be likened to the evolutionarily ancient reptilian brain, which ensures that the newer and much more cleverer neocortex is employed in the service of goals such as feeding and copulation. One might question whether such an inverse meritocracy could remain stable if the bulk of the superintelligent subagents were found to be corrupt and the humans in charge of the whole thing attempted to roll back many of the preceding enhancements. Would the institutional structure be strong enough to withstand the opposition that such a move would engender? In the context of historical or contemporary humanities, societies, the answer perhaps is that this would be implausible. Not that the most capable people consistently rise to power, but we are not literally ruled by chimpanzees either. The issue is less clear, however, in a context where society is implemented as software. Imagine a digital hierarchy that has one highly trained police agent for every 2 proletarians. It also has one special police agent for every 2 police agents. It also has one special police agent for every 2 special police agents, and so forth, so that each layer of overseers has at least half the numbers of the layered overseas. Imagine further that this society is architected in such a way that a supervisor has big advantages over his subordinates. For example, the supervisor is able to monitor and record everything his subordinates say and do, whereas the supervisor himself is hidden behind a one-way glass, so that his subordinates can only hear the orders and instructions that the superior chooses to transmit. Imagine that supervisors have a panel of buttons that they can press at any time to cause a subordinate to be punished or rewarded, paused, deleted, or reverted to an earlier state. These capabilities would greatly boost the powers of a supervising agent beyond what has been possible historically in even the most totalitarian of organizations. Even this does not exhaust the possible instruments of our control. Supervisors may also have at their disposal realistic virtual reality simulations that they can use to probe subordinate reactions to hypothetical scenarios, such as simulated offers to join a conspiracy or to slack when they think nobody's watching. Supervisors might additionally have the ability to eavesdrop on internal monologues in the subordinates' minds and to directly manipulate their emotional states. The upshot is a series of massive advantages for the supervisor. Each supervisor would be a subordinate to another higher-level supervisor who would monitor his every move and make sure he did not slacken in the execution of his managerial duties. With this kind of arrangement, it might be possible for the structure to be stable even if each supervisory level is intellectually somewhat weaker than the level it supervises. And the entire structure, which could include many highly intelligent superintelligent agents, may be controlled by a smaller number of humans with root access. The cost of such an internal control structure would be significant but not necessarily prohibitive. For example, in the model where each level of supervision has half the numbers of the layer below, the extra computational overhead is bounded at a mere 100% of what the proletarian part of the system costs. Less if the dumber boss layer requires fewer computations per subagent. Oversight could be tightened by increasing the ratio or cost lowered by decreasing it. The extra computational cost would be a major factor in a competitive market scenario, but looks affordable in the context of a project that is not facing strong immediate competition. There would also be a cost in terms of the development time needed to create and test these supervisory functionalities. A well-resourced project could reduce this time cost by parallelizing the development of the control structure with the development of the machine intelligence, but the extra task load could be prohibitive for smaller projects and for projects caught in a close technology race. One other type of cost also deserves consideration: the risk of mind crimes being committed in this kind of structure. As described, the institution sounds like a rather horrible North Korean labor camp. Yet, there are ways of at least mitigating the moral problems with running this kind of institution, even if the subagents contained in the institution are emulations with full human moral status. At a minimum, the system could rely on volunteering emulations. Each subagent could have the option at any time of withdrawing its participation. Terminated emulations could be stored to memory, with a commitment to restart them under much more ideal conditions once the dangerous phase of the intelligence explosion is over. Meanwhile, subagents who choose to participate could be housed in very comfortable virtual environments and allow ample time for sleep and recreation. These measures would impose a cost, one that should be manageable for a well-resourced project under non-competitive conditions. In a highly competitive situation, the cost may be unaffordable unless an enterprise could be assured that its competitors would incur the same cost. In the example, we imagine the subagents as emulations. One might wonder, does the institution design approach require that the subagents be anthropomorphic? Or is it equally applicable to systems composed of artificial subagents? Owen's first thought here might be skeptical. One notes that, despite our plentiful experience with human-like agents, we still cannot precisely predict the outbreak or outcomes of revolutions. Social science can, at most, describe some statistical tendencies. Since we cannot reliably predict the stability of social structures for ordinary human beings about which we have much data, it is tempting to infer that we have little hope of precision engineering stable social structures for cognitively enhanced human-like agents about which we have no data, and that we still have less hope of doing so for advanced artificial agents, which are not even similar to the agents we have the data about. Yet the matter is not so cut and dried. Human and human-like beings are complex, but artificial agents could have relatively simple architectures. Artificial agents could also have simple and explicitly characterized motivations. Furthermore, digital agents in general, whether emulations or artificial intelligences, are copyable, an affordance that may revolutionize management, much like interchangeable parts revolutionized manufacturing. These differences, together with the opportunity to work with agents that are initially powerless and to create institutional structures that use the various above-mentioned control measures, might combine to make it possible to achieve particular institutional outcomes, such as a system that does not revolt, more reliably than if one were working with human beings under historical conditions. But then again, artificial intelligence or artificial agents might lack many of the attributes that help us predict the behavior of human-like agents. Artificial agents may not need have any of the social emotions that bind human behavior, emotions such as fear, pride, and remorse, nor need artificial agents develop attachments to friends and family, nor need they exhibit the unconscious body language that makes it difficult for us humans to conceal our intentions. These deficits might destabilize institutions of artificial agents, excuse me. Moreover, artificial agents might be capable of making big leaps in cognitive performance as a result of seemingly small changes in their algorithms or architecture. Ruthlessly optimizing artificial agents might be willing to take extreme gambles on which humans would shrink. And superintelligent agents might show a surprising ability to coordinate with little or no communication, e.g. by internally modeling each other's hypothetical responses to various contingencies. These and other differences could make sudden institutional failure more likely, even in the teeth of what seem like Kevlar-clad methods of social control. It is unclear, therefore, how promising the institution design approach is, and whether it has a greater chance of working with anthropomorphic than with artificial agents. It might be thought that creating an institution with appropriate checks and balances could only increase safety, or at any rate not reduce safety, so that from a risk mitigation perspective it would always be the best if the method were used. But even this cannot be said with certainty. The approach adds parts and complexity, and thus may also introduce new ways for things to go wrong that do not exist in the case of an agent that does not have any intelligent subagents as parts. Nevertheless, institution design is worthy of further exploration. Synopsis. Goal system engineering is not yet an established discipline. It is not currently known how to transfer human values to a digital computer, even given human-level machine intelligence. Having investigated a number of approaches, we found that some of them appear to be dead ends, but others appear to hold promise and deserve to be explored further. A summary is provided in Table 12. Okay, so this is just a summary of the concepts touched upon: explicit representation, evolutionary selection, reinforcement learning, value accretion, motivational scaffolding, value learning, emulation modeling, institution design. If we knew how to solve the value loading problem, we would confront a further problem, the problem of deciding which values to load. What, in other words, would we want a superintelligence to want? This is the more philosophical problem to which we turn next. Okay. Which values to load? Choosing the criteria for choosing. What values do we load into a super AI? This will be for next stream, but I'm going to read this summary now here. Or synopsis, I suppose. Suppose we could install any arbitrary final value into a seed AI. The decision as to which value to install could then have the most far-reaching consequences. Certain other basic parameter choices concerning the axioms of the AI's decision theory and epistemology could be similarly consequential, but foolish, ignorant, and narrow-minded that we are, how could we be trusted to make good design decisions? How could we choose without locking in forever the prejudices and preconceptions of the present generation? In this chapter, we explore how indirect normativity can let us offload much of the cognitive work involved in making these decisions onto the superintelligence itself, while still anchoring the outcome in deeper human values. Okay, that will be for next time. Next time we will be reading... Oh, my mouse. Right in time, just in time. My mouse ran out of battery as I was reading this bit. So that was the last bit. That was chapter 10, 11, 12. We touched upon oracles. So just, okay, what if we made it ChatGPT is basically what this chapter was. And it's a good chapter. It made a lot of sense. Multipolar scenarios, forces and man. Yeah, okay. So this was, what if there were multiple superintelligences that arise, that had arisen at once, instead of just one like monopoly of a super AI. It's like multiple super AIs. What would that look like? What would that conflict look like? And finally, acquiring values. If we make a superintelligence, a general superintelligence, to make our decisions for us and to think for us and to help us solve problems, it probably needs a moral compass. It needs to have some values. It needs to have some way to act, to make decisions like humans would, like a good human would. How does that work? How would we do that? That was chapter 12. Next time, we will be covering the last stretch of chapters, chapter 13, 14, and 15. Chapter 13 is choosing the criteria for choosing. So, okay, what exactly are the values we will choose then? Hypothetically, let's just assume we can choose any values to put into this AI. What would they be? Is it like kindness, love? Like how do you even define that? Like what is that? 14, the strategic picture. So what is this one going to be about? I think like maybe just AI in the larger scope of technology and how that would interact with each other in the strategic picture. And last but not least, crunch time, philosophy with a deadline, what is to be done. I assume that chapter 15, the last one, will be about the urgency of the issues, I guess, that were presented here in this book. Cool. I'm assuming nobody has any questions. The last bit made much more sense to me, or at least it made more sense than the chapter 11. It's basically just a bunch of speculative math and model creating of like, okay, how do we create an AI that could receive values or could read like intention or whatever, like that was kind of what that was. But we'll finish the book next week. Yes. Hello, Charis. Hi Faye. Hello. You came in just as I was ending stream, but that's fine. We were just reading Superintelligence by Nick Bostrom. We're on like the final stretch now, and it's seeming to me more and more as I read this book more and more that it really is a matter of time that superintelligence emerges, and like when it does emerge, we are not thinking enough about what we should be doing when it does. He's very insightful. Sorry, let me read the other comment first. I think I'm a professional at coming in as your stream is ending. Well, that's just the way the times work. I'm not in the American time zones. I imagine this time is usually when the Americans get onto YouTube, so that makes sense. That makes sense to me. But I operate on a different time zone, so it's a time zone thing. He's very insightful considering he was writing this before the time of ChatGPT and all that. Oh yeah. Bearing all of this in mind, this book was written in 2014, 11 years ago, way before ChatGPT, way before all the things, and he predicted with very good accuracy what those things that would happen were and what they would look like. He didn't predict like, I think so far in this like book, in this reading, and for pretty much the whole book, right? And I'll give my further comments next stream, like for the whole book, but let me just give some comments right now. One of the things with this with Superintelligence by Nick Bostrom is it's really accurate, but also not accurate. He thinks a lot about the machines. I think Bostrom is really good at thinking about the tech and like the way the tech is developed and the controversy that could arise from it, and how, you know, that tech would lead into, well, in this book at least, a super intelligence, right? A super AI that takes control of stuff. And he sees the path to it. He sees that the path will lead there, but he doesn't see what that path looks like yet, which makes sense, right? Because I'm saying this man could not predict what would happen in the next 10 years. Nobody could have. Nobody in 2014 could have predicted what the hell would have happened in the next 10 years. But it's so interesting to see that there are some overlaps. There are a lot of overlaps between now and then. But if he had written that with now in mind, I feel as though maybe he would be... there would be more writing, for example, on the Oracle bit, right? Or is it here? Oracles, genies, sovereigns, and tools. There would be a lot more writing here in chapter 10 if he had written this with the benefit of the hindsight that is 2025. And well, the guy's alive now. He could write another book, and he's written another book like 2 years ago. Let me see. Nick Bostrom. He is. Where are his publications? Books. Sorry, I'm on his Wikipedia page and I see like public reception. The book became this book, right? Like Superintelligence. It became a New York Times bestseller. Okay, yeah, all books do. And received positive feedback from personalities such as Stephen Hawking, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Peter Singer, and Derek Parfit. That's a lot of very different people. Those are a lot of different people that like this book. That's really interesting. It was praised for offering clear and compelling arguments on a neglected yet important topic. It was sometimes criticized for spreading pessimism about the potential of AI or for focusing on long-term and speculative risks. Some skeptics, such as Daniel Dennett or Oren Zioni, contended that superintelligence is too far away for that risk to be significant. Jan LeCun considers that there is no existential risk, asserting that superintelligent AI will have no desire for self-preservation and that experts can be trusted to make it safe. Okay. Interesting. But after that, he's made a book last year. He published a book last year, Bostrom, Deep Utopia, Life and Meaning in a Solved World. Bostrom explores the concept of an ideal life if humanity transitions successfully into a post-superintelligence world. He notes that the question is not how interesting a future is to look at, but how good it is to live in. He outlines some technologies that he considers physically possible in theory and available at technological maturity, such as cognitive enhancement, reversal of aging, arbitrary sensory inputs, or the precise control of motivation, mood, well-being, and personality. According to him, not only machines would be better than humans at working, but they would also undermine the purpose of many leisure activities, providing extreme welfare while challenging the quest for meaning. That sounds like a weird read. Interesting. Anyways, I just scrolled down and then I saw like 1996 email incident and that oh, there he sent like a really racist email. Okay, good to know. We need to ground our authors and who we're reading in the worst light possible, so we can only think of the ideas and not glorify the person. All right, good to know that he was once incredibly racist. All right. That concludes today's stream for Bostrom's Superintelligence, Paths, Dangers, and Strategies. I think it's an interesting book. I think it's speculative. I think it's comprehensive. I think the arguments are very solid. And I think that this was a good book to read overall. I'll see everyone maybe next week. Think next Sunday. Yeah, we'll do it next Sunday. What a way to end it. I know. I was scrolling on his Wikipedia and then I went to the... Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know he had an email incident. Uh-oh. Anyways. Next Sunday, we will continue reading this book. The last 3 chapters we will read next Sunday. In the meantime, though, tomorrow I'll be streaming again. I'll be streaming Metal Gear Rising Revengeance, which is a lot more adrenaline and blood pumping than reading a book. I hope to see people there. That will be fun, I think. And that is all. thank you, everyone. And if you have any questions about the book, you probably don't. But if you do, then you can ask me in other streams as well, and I'll try my best to answer. But yeah. Or you can leave a comment in the VOD. You know, you can do that too. You're a free person. You can do what you want. All right, goodbye.